Hello everyone, welcome to the first of a potential series I want to get kicked off. A lot of fans and some friends have asked me what my favorite story that I've narrated is. The word favorites being used loosely, as many stories could fit a favorite category, but for different reasons, such as theme, character developments, creature design, plot twists, etc. Here are a few that I have greatly enjoyed, and some that have stayed memorable over time. We can call them my horror story starter set. Please feel free to send this video to a first-time listener, friend, lover, grandparents, whoever may enjoy it. And if nothing else, you may be getting sent this video because your crush had nothing better to add to your one-word conversation, Zach. I'm sure that may have freaked out some of the Zachs in the audience, but I digress. If you're a first-time listener, welcome. I hope you enjoy my content, and I appreciate your time. Or, if anything, you may enjoy my voice, in which case, I'm flattered. So sit back, relax, get comfortably buried in your favorite blankets, and let's delve into the dark together. I'm sure you know that the world is full of terrible things. Things that if you were by chance encounter, would kill you with the same ease that you would kill an insect. The fact that humanity is a fairly weak and inconsequential species is a strange and paradoxical fact. On some level, we all know it, and yet, if the full truth of the matter goes out there will be no doubt be mass hysteria. People are afraid enough as it is, given the state of the world today, and I don't believe that making them aware of gods and monsters will improve the situation. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Robert Marsh, and as you might have guessed, I've had a bit more exposure to the supernatural than most. I've spent a significant portion of the past 500 years researching it for my own purposes. As for what ignited my interest in the supernatural, that would be vampirism. Long ago, a man I once knew saw fit to curse me with undeath, and since then I have been burdened with eternity, a life without end. It wasn't long after I became a vampire that I decided I might as well use my new time and learn all I could about my new condition, which led me down the rabbit hole of the supernatural. I've cavorted with fae, gods, spirits, and mystics, among other things, over the years. I've learned secrets that could bring civilization itself to its knees, and I suppose all that knowledge was what got the attention of the FRB. I have heard of the International Fae Relations Bureau, known to most as the FRB, prior to their initial approach of me. I thought very little of them at the time, which should not be interpreted as I thought poorly of them. I simply regarded them as another group of idealists hoping to foster a better relationship between humanity and other non-human entities. While it seemed a noble cause, I'd seen their like rise and fall before and was ready to dismiss them as nothing more than another group of well-meaning, yet doomed fools. That was until I actually met them, at least. The year was 1985, and I was living in Rome, Italy. My life was quiet and more or less peaceful. By day, I worked in sales for a moderately sized company. Not the most exciting career for an entity such as myself, but money is a necessity to survive, and with it, I was able to live a modest life in relative comfort. Every few nights, I would go to the more expensive bars, and when a woman caught my fancy, I would make her my companion for the evening. Usually we would drink and move between bars before we retired together for the evening. While my nighttime companions were often beautiful, I was never one to overstep boundaries. Sometimes our brief relationships would grow more intimate. Other times we would simply part ways after I'd taken what I needed. An unfortunate side effect of being a vampire is that I need blood to survive. Many details regarding my kind are simple mythology. fatal weakness to sunlight, the ability to shapeshift, and a fear of silver or crucifixes. However, our thirst for blood is all too real. I've never enjoyed taking a life, and while I could easily drain the blood from a person if I so wished, I can survive on lighter, albeit more frequent, meals. My nighttime companions were usually too drunk to remember what I'd taken, and I always took care to ensure their wounds were dressed before I left them. In my long life, I have only had to claim a handful of lives, and I assure you that most of those were in self-defense. The FRB contacted me on one of my nights out. I had visited a lovely little bar that I liked to frequent and ordered myself the usual glass of red wine as I surveyed the other visitors. Most had come in pairs or groups. I was looking for the loners, much like myself, someone I could befriend for the evening. Male or female, it didn't matter to me. What I spotted was a young woman in a tight black dress, sitting by the bar. She was alone and quite lovely to behold. She looked disinterested in the world around her, and the empty glasses by her side told me that she was looking to get drunk. I knew her kind. I waved the bartender over and gave him my instructions. "Get her another drink, on me," I said, and the bartender nodded before going off to do just that. I watched as he served her drink, and just as I'd expected, she looked over at me. I raised my glass to toast her, and she raised hers in turn, before taking a long sip. I took that as my invitation to go over. "Mind if I join you?" I asked. "Not at all, Mr. Marshall," she replied, and I paused. I very rarely gave out the name I was currently living under to strangers, but she seemed to know it instinctively. I caught a wary smile on her lips as she polished off her drink. "You can sit down. I'm here to talk, not to pick a fight," she said. I hesitated for a moment before taking her up on her offer. "All right," I said. "Let's talk then." "I know you're out to feed tonight, so I won't take up too much of your time," she promised. "I have to make sure I got your attention, though, and you do have a type, Mr. Marsh." "A single man should be allowed the pleasure of pleasant company if he so chooses," I reply. Of course. I didn't mean to imply otherwise," the woman said. "Here, let me just clear the air. My name is Amanda Spector. I'm with the International Fey Relations Bureau." My eyebrows quirked slightly. "You're familiar with us?" she asked. "The name has come up before, yes. What exactly do you want with me?" "Word on the street is you've been around the block. Seen a lot, done a lot. It must have taught you a lot, too." "If you're looking for information, there are more knowledgeable creatures out there, Miss Spencer." "I know. We've even gone so far as to employ some of them. The FRB's interest in you is a little more hands-on. Sitting behind a desk doesn't suit you, Mr. Marsh." "And what exactly is that interest?" "Public safety," she replied. "The FRB is young, but we aren't stupid. Not everything out there wants peace, and there's countless things that just don't give a damn. To that end, they've started to put together a little subdivision. Most of our recruits so far are human, and while they've gone well enough, the higher-ups are in agreement that we could use something a little more familiar with these matters." "So what? You're recruiting me into your secret police?" I scoffed. I took another sip of my red wine. "Hardly. The Department of Public Safety is meant to protect people from the things out there that pose a threat. Ghouls, rogue vampires, and sirens. Things that could cause some damage if left unchecked. I don't need to tell you that there are more and more incidents every day, and if these things get out, the FRB is toast. I'm recruiting you to protect people." I swirled the wine in my glass thoughtfully. And it ends at monsters and rogues, correct? I asked. I looked over at her. If that's what you're asking, then I'll consider it. But I'm not an assassin, Miss Spencer. I'm not looking for one. I'm looking for a guardian, she replied. There was something in her eyes that made me believe her. Desperation, sincerity, I'm still not sure which. I finished my glass and stood up. I'll think about it, I said. That's all I ask, she replied, and set a business card on the table. When you're ready to start, give me a call. I pocketed the card and she tipped me one final smile before I left. I had no intention of ever calling her, but the words she said lingered in my mind. I can't say I had much faith in the FRB, but if nothing else, I respected their interactions, and I suppose that was enough. I called Spectre at dawn the next day, and I never looked back. My orientation within the FRB did not last long. Technically speaking, I already had centuries of experience in the field, so the biggest thing to adjust to was the new system. It wasn't long before I received my first assignment and was out in the field working for them. The briefing said that there had been an attack on a small cottage just north of Naples. A family had been killed by something that had come out of the woods, presumably by a ghoul, judging by the description of the carnage it had inflicted. Ghouls are particularly nasty creatures. Stripped of their humanity by inhuman powers, all that remains of them are pale, malformed husks who only think about their next meal, whatever that may be. They are gruesome creatures who often run afoul of civilization, and the act of killing them is a mercy. I had been instructed to visit a certain restaurant 2 kilometers away from the site of the attack. It was there that I would meet my soon-to-be partner, Gustav Hauser. Gustav was a short and stocky man, although much of his bulk seemed to be muscle. His skin was pale and his eyes were a cold blue. He wore his long brown hair down to a ponytail. I recognized him on sight as he entered the restaurant, and he seemed to pick me out of the modest lunch crowd immediately. The moment he laid eyes on me, he regarded me with an intensity that made me slightly uneasy. I knew disgust when I saw it, but I pretended to ignore it in favor of at least attempting to begin a proper working relationship. "You're the vampire?" he asked as he sat down across from me. "Just call me Marshall," I replied. "Mr. Hauser, I presume." "Gustav," he corrected. "I assume you've been briefed." I have. Most likely a ghoul attack. I'd assume you'd seen a lot of those, correct?" Gustav scoffed. "Once a week, more or less. Damn things are everywhere. Never gets easy seeing them. I don't suppose they'd affect you much given your condition." "On the contrary. I've seen their like for centuries, and they've never failed to disturb me. Immortality doesn't chip away at one's humanity if you don't let it." He let out a huff that could have meant many things. "We'll leave when the sun goes down," he said. "See if we can't draw the ghoul out." "Wouldn't it be more difficult to engage it at night?" I asked. "Yes, but considering your condition, I can move perfectly fine in daylight, if that's what you're worried about," I interrupted. "Please don't worry about my condition. I can assure you that it won't be a hindrance or a threat. I can assure you it won't too," he replied. "If you think you're up for it, we could head out after you eat. You do eat, don't you?" "On occasion," I replied. "The lobster looked particularly appetizing, if you're a seafood man." Again, Gustav huffed, sounding less annoyed this time. He picked up his menu and skimmed through it without another word. Perhaps he might not have liked me right off the bat, but I could work with that. After we ate, we drove to the cottage. It was a quiet little place, well off the beaten path. A prime spot for a ghoul. As we drove up to the old building, I could see the broken glass of the windows and the yellow lines of the police tape. Gustav parked just outside the tape, and we both got out. We approached the building together, and I could smell the old blood inside. "How long ago was the attack?" I asked. The bodies were discovered 12 hours ago, Gustav replied. The attack probably happened last night. Someone heard gunshots and came to investigate. Before you ask, I looked into reports of missing pets as well. There were 8 in the past year. Rather high for a place so remote, I noted. Gustav huffed in agreement. The cottages are new. Chances are they backed onto the ghoul's territory, he said as he spoke. I scanned the nearby woods. I suspected that Gustav was correct, and if so, our quarry would not be far. I approached the cottage and stepped inside. The stench of stale blood overpowered my senses, although I doubted that Gustav noticed anything. Even without the chalk outlines, I knew exactly where the bodies had fallen. From the look of it, Ghoul came in the living room window, Gustav said. The mother was found nearby in the kitchen. And imagine her screams woke her husband, who got his gun and attacked the Ghoul. He was found in the hallway, and their son was killed in his bed, I replied. Gustav paused. I can smell the blood in the sheets from here. They found blood there, but no body. I grimaced at the knowledge of what the Ghoul had done. Yet, in taking something back to its hideout to feast on, it had marked a trail. I walked over to the broken window and looked out at the forest beyond. It was faint, but I could smell blood in the distance, along with the stink of decay. We'll look for tracks, Gustav said. Might be best to check the area outside that window. No need, I replied. It's close. Gustav paused. I can smell it. Old blood, human decay. I've been around long enough to recognize it. It's faint, but I think I can track it. Christ, you can smell it? He asked. A benefit of my condition. My senses of smell and hearing are much better than yours, among other things. No shit. I suppose I can see why Spectre wanted your kind on the DPS. If you think you can find that thing, lead the way. He drew a pistol from his holster, something high caliber. Probably good enough to kill a ghoul. He followed me out of the cottage and towards the tree line. While we weren't looking for tracks, I still noticed them in the dirt, and we moved into the woods. The smell was getting stronger, and though I trusted my nose, the trees around us made me feel claustrophobic. My senses would only lead us to a corpse, not the ghoul itself. The creature could have been anywhere nearby, and so we tread lightly. The closer we got, the stronger the smell became. There were no doubt several bodies nearby, fresh and rotten meat to feed the insatiable hunger of the ghoul. Up ahead, I spotted a small stone hill. The smell seemed to be coming from there, and as we got closer, I recognized a dip in the ground that led into a small cavern. I held up a hand to stop Gustav. I pointed to the cave. I'll go first, I whispered. Lure it out if it's in there. I trust you're a steady shot. Very, he promised. I've got you covered. Though I had few reasons to truly trust Gustav, I still silently held him to that word as I began my approach to the cave. In the low light, my eyes could see bones picked clean. Most of them looked animal, but there were a few I recognized as human. The ghoul's lair had a rotten, wet stink to it. Bad enough that I covered my mouth as I got closer, and yet, as foul as its little hole was, it looked to be completely empty. I grimaced as I spotted the ribcage of what I knew to be the missing child before taking a step back and looking over at Gustav. I shook my head. The ghoul wasn't there. And yet as I looked at him, I saw my eyes widen. The trees, he called and raised the gun and fired before I realized just what he'd seen. A heavy weight bore down on me, forcing me to the ground. I heard the snap of hungry jaws by my ear, but they missed me entirely. I kicked and shoved at the creature on top of me and knocked it aside. I saw its spindly, grayish limbs struggle for a moment as it regained its footing. It looked at me with wide, unblinking eyes, tangled hair falling around its face and dried blood around its mouth. The ghoul hissed at me before clawing its way towards me. I scrambled to my feet, but I wasn't fast enough. Its claws raked at my back and dug into my flesh as it pulled me towards it. Its breath stank of rotten meat. It tried to sink its teeth into me, but I grabbed it by the skull and held it back as its jaws snapped wildly. I heard another gunshot, and a spray of blood erupted from its neck. The ghoul hissed and tried to look at Gustav before he shot it again, blowing away its head. Still, the damn thing stood, although only for a second longer, before its bony limbs collapsed from underneath it. Lifeless, it collapsed to the ground beside me and rolled down into the cave to join the other dead. I looked down at it, panting heavily, and thankfully I had suffered nothing more than a few scratches. The body of the ghoul twitched as if it was still trying to stand up. Once upon a time, that thing had probably been a lovely young woman. Now it was just another monster. "Can't do everything, can you, vampire?" Gustav asked, his tone cocky. He offered me a hand to help me to my feet. "I suppose not," I replied, breathlessly. "Damn good shooting." "I've had some practice. We should move the body, burn it and contact the police." He looked down into the cavern at the body of the child who'd been there. "I'm sure someone will want to give that kid a proper burial." I nodded in response before following Gustav down to collect what was left of the ghoul. While I cannot pretend my relationship with Gustav was ever perfect, I must admit that the first job was the start of a solid partnership. He never did seem to warm to my condition, but over the next 4 years, it became easier and easier to trust him with my life. Together, he and I put down rogue sirens, who chose to overfeed or hunt for sport, groups of deep mermaids who'd grown too aggressive, and countless malevolent fae who sought only to spread chaos for fun. Despite our differences, I came to regard Gustav as a trusted friend, and I'd like to believe that he came to think of me in a similar manner. Perhaps that was what made our final job so difficult. On June 12, 1989, 2 hikers in the Ukraine were attacked by an unknown entity, something they described as humanoid. Naturally, the FRB investigated the claims and concluded that it was a likely ghoul attack, and within 6 hours of the police report, Gustav and I were asked to investigate. The trail was remote and designed for more advanced hikers. I can't imagine it saw much use. It would have been ideal for a ghoul to call home. As I walked through the heavy underbrush well ahead of Gustav, I can't say that I anticipated anything other than a standard ghoul encounter. I expected to pick up the scent of decay anytime soon, or, if we were lucky, perhaps the much fainter, wet stink of a ghoul or its lair. I scanned the trees above me, and Gustav had his weapon drawn as we drew nearer to the spot where the attack had supposedly happened. "You smell anything?" Gustav asked. "Just the forest," I replied and paused. That wasn't entirely true. "There's something sweeter in the air here. Not blood. Nothing I'm familiar with." "If it's sweet, it's not our ghoul," Gustav said. He paused for a moment before adding, "Assuming it is a ghoul, could have just been a bear." "How many times have we told people it was just a bear?" I asked. He responded with one of his trademark huffs. "Maybe this time it really was. You ever seen a bear with a mange, Marsh? Terrifying fucking things. They're bony, their flesh is pale, they look like zombies." "Then the least we can do is confirm it," I said. "If nothing else, the walking is good for you." Again, Gustav huffed. "Whatever you say, Mr. Liquid Diet." We hadn't gone much farther before the sweet smell I detected grew stronger. It was almost blinding now, and amongst the dark foliage I could see something small and luminous peeking out. I approached it, slowly, and bent down to get a closer look. "What is it?" Gustav asked as I examined it. "A flower," I replied, and that was the simplest description of it. The flower was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It had 5 petals, and its colors seemed to shift from blue to green, and even pink. There was a slight glow coming off of it, and its smell was strong and sweet. I delicately plucked it before wrapping it up in a handkerchief. I could show this to someone back at the office. Maybe they'd know what to make of it. From the corner of my eye, I saw the slight glow from other flowers, identical to the one I found. In the dim light, they were easy to see. "What is this?" Gustav asked warily. "Hell if I know," I replied as I stood up. "But something about this doesn't sit right with me." "It's a flower," he said. "What's there to be worried about?" "Humanity fears what it does not understand for good reason, my friend," I replied. "This flora doesn't look natural. I'd consider that very good cause for concern." Gustav responded with another huff. "A flower's a flower, vampire. Relax." Quietly, he scanned the area around us before pausing. I heard a rustling of leaves, and my partner took off at full speed, gun drawn. "Wait!" I called, but Gustav was always the sort to leap before he looked. By the time I was up again, I heard gunshots followed by a scream from him. I raced off in the direction Gustav had gone. I heard one final gunshot and a sound, an inhuman squeal that sent a chill through me. The last gunshot had been close. Gustav was just ahead, and when I found him, he was slumped up against a tree, coughing and hacking. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something dart off into the woods, but my attention was focused more on my partner. "Are you all right?" I asked. I offered him a hand, but he pushed it aside and climbed unsteadily to his feet. "I'm fine," he spat. "Fucking thing jumped me. It's a goddamn ghoul." "Are you hurt?" I asked. "Bites, scratches?" "Scrapes and bruises. I'm fine, mother," he growled, before pushing past me to head deeper into the woods. "Come on, let's kill this damn thing." I would have voiced my protest, but Gustav was a stubborn fool. He would have pressed ahead no matter what I said, and perhaps he was right for that. We had the ghoul on the run. It should have been easy to catch up now. Still, the deep sound of Gustav's hacking cough did not sit well with me. Up ahead of him, I could see the glow of several more of those strange flowers. "The sun is getting low. It might not be wise to be wandering out here so late," I warned. "What, are you scared of the dark?" Gustav wheezed. "Come on." He broke down into another fit of coughing and gripped a tree to prevent himself from collapsing. "You think you're funny," I replied. "You can barely stand up, and that cough, it doesn't sound right." "That fucking ghoul sprayed me with something," Gustav replied. "I don't know what. Something sweet that stank. I'll be fine. I just need to clear my lungs. I can keep going." I stared at him, watching as he stood up and knowing that I'd needed to drag him kicking and screaming out of the woods if I wanted him to leave. I also knew that he'd probably shoot me if I tried. With a resigned sigh, I drew my own pistol and followed him. At the very least, I could ensure my thick-skulled partner didn't get himself killed. I had hoped that we might find the dying ghoul nearby, but we had no such luck. I couldn't even smell any blood from its supposed wounds. While Gustav was adamant he had hit his target, I had my doubts. Our quarry had run far, and I couldn't even hear its rustling movements in the distance. As we walked through the forest, the sky began to darken, but the shimmering hues from the flowers around us lit our path. Gustav cut ahead of me, pausing every few moments to cough. In the forest, it was difficult to mark our path already, but with my partner so far ahead, it was next to impossible, even for me. We continued onwards to the point where I wasn't even sure we were on the trail of the creature who had attacked us. The only change in our environment was those glowing flowers that seemed more plentiful than before. They polluted the air with an overpowering sweetness that was enough to make me cough. "Gustav!" I called. He didn't look back at me. "Gustav, it's been almost an hour. We're wasting our time. The ghoul is gone." He just kept going, fueled by a rage that seemed unlike him. I watched him for a moment as he vanished deeper into the woods before I followed, jogging to catch up to him. "Gustav!" I called as I put a hand on his shoulder. He looked back at me, eyes burning with rage. "It's gone. We should turn back." "It's here," Gustav replied. "It's in the ocean. Don't you feel it?" I paused. There was something in his gaze, something very wrong. He pulled out of my grip. "Not much farther," he said. "Trust me." I watched him go, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt uneasy. Ghouls did not scare me. Neither did mermaids, fays, werewolves, or even other vampires. These were all terrible things I knew how to deal with. But Gustav in that moment scared me. We continued for over an hour, and it wasn't long before I noticed that the sound of our movement was the only sound I heard. Usually in such pristine forest, there would be other sounds of life, but around us the world was silent. No birds, no animals, nothing at all. While I'd known animals to fear ghouls before, this was different. Gustav didn't seem to notice, though. I doubt he thought of anything but the prey ahead of him. At some point, we started up an incline, and I watched him claw at the earth and climb with single-minded purpose. The strange flowers bloomed thick around us and continued to pollute the air with their sweet stench. "There," I heard him rasp. "Up there." It took me a moment to see what he saw. While the darkness did not impair my vision, it would have been easy to miss the overgrown wood that marked the entrance to an old mine. The tunnel into the earth was overgrown by moss, and yet, deep inside the cavern, I could see the glow of more of those flowers, shimmering like stars. "In there," Gustav rasped, before breaking into another coughing fit. To his credit, it seemed less severe than before. "There, it's in there." Near the entrance of the mine, I spotted old splintered wood. Someone had boarded it up long ago, and something else had forced its way inside. "Let's go," Gustav said before shambling off into the darkness. I stopped him. "Are you insane? You'll be blind in there." "You're coming with me, aren't you?" he asked. Now it was my turn to huff in response. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted an old lantern sitting abandoned just inside the mine. It didn't take long to light a little flame inside it. It was rusted, bent, and a little broken, but it sufficed. "Of all the fucking vampires I could get, I get the priss," Gustav murmured. "I'm doing this for your benefit, not mine," I replied. He didn't reply and just turned to trudge off into the mine. I followed him, keeping the lantern aloft. My every instinct told me that going farther was a mistake, but my partner had made up his mind long ago. The stink of those radiant flowers was almost blinding. Even if the ghoul had made its home in this old mine, I doubt I would have smelled it. Yet, despite my caution, Gustav continued to press on ahead. I noticed a few rotten old supports that looked like they wouldn't hold well. I'd seen them by the entrance of the mine, too. The place looked as if it was ready to collapse any day now. "How exactly do you know where this thing is?" I asked. "I just know," he replied. "I feel it. First I was just following the trail, but now I feel it, Marsh. It's hard to explain." My brow furrowed as I followed him. "That doesn't worry you?" I asked, and again he didn't reply. All the same, I found myself falling back a few steps, distancing myself from my partner. Up ahead, I heard movement, bony limbs shuffling against rock. While I couldn't smell the ghoul, I knew that Gustav's senses had led him to the right place. The luminous flowers around us shimmered in their strange hues. My pace slowed a little bit as I looked forward at Gustav. He kept his gun at the ready, expecting the ghoul to jump out at any moment. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement and heard the sound of claw against stone. I spun around just in time to see a shape retreat inside a side branch of the cavern, and I reached for my gun. "There!" I called. I didn't wait around for Gustav to come. Instinct took over as I pursued the ghoul and thoughtlessly abandoned my partner. Ahead, I could clearly see the ghoul scuttling like an insect along the wall, yet there seemed to be something wrong with it. The shimmering flowers that had accompanied us all the way up to the cavern seemed to be growing out of the ghoul's skin. Its flesh itself seemed to shift against its bones, and when it turned back to hiss at me, it seemed to grin knowingly. I could hear Gustav's footsteps rushing up behind me as the ghoul turns to fight. I fired my gun twice. The first shot blew away a chunk of its skull, and the second went into its shoulder. Neither of them slowed it down. Instead, the ghoul rushed towards me on all fours without stopping. I saw its mouth open, but not in the way it should have opened. Its lower jaw split apart, and much of its neck opened as well, revealing teeth that should not have been there, but even worse, pale yellow eyes. I fired again, shooting into its terrible maw as it advanced on me, but the bullets did nothing. In my desperation, I hurled the lantern at it. The lighter fluid I used to ignite it caught on the flesh of the thing before me, and its body was set ablaze like dry tinder. It shrank back with a pained screech as its flesh sizzled and pulled back from the flames like something alive. I stumbled backwards, watching as the creature burned and shambled backwards. Perhaps the flames themselves wouldn't have been enough to kill it, but in its panic, it clumsily stumbled into the walls lined with flowers. The stray flames set those alight too, and all too quickly the fire spread. I looked back and saw Gustav standing behind me, staring wide-eyed and helpless at the ghoul he'd so desperately pursued. I didn't give him much time to watch. I ran for him and grabbed him by the arm before pulling him back the way we came. We hadn't gone too far into the cavern. It was easy enough to find our way back out, and I tugged him along behind me as the old mine very quickly became an inferno. As we reached its mouth, we stumbled out into the moonlight, and I looked back to see a hellish glow in our wake. Gustav stared back at it in turn, panting heavily before looking at me. "That ghoul," he finally said. "What the hell was that? It was a ghoul, right?" "Maybe once," I replied. I looked around at the flowers that surrounded us, and I felt my heart race in a way that it hadn't in centuries. These flowers, they did something to it. It corrupted it somehow. We need to call this in, quarantine the area, torch and burn everything, get rid of them all. Wait, get rid of it?" Gustav asked. "Marsh, what the hell are you talking about?" "Didn't you see what I saw? That ghoul had those flowers growing out of it, and it was warped. It was something else entirely. It shrugged off our bullets. What if more creatures got exposed to these flowers? Hell, we've been exposed. What might it do to us?" Gustav just laughed, his lips curled into a smile. It didn't fit well on his face. "I think you're overthinking this, my friend," he said. "That ghoul, it was beautiful, don't you think? I mean, look at these flowers. They turned something so disgusting, so horrible as a ghoul into something new, something fierce and beautiful. It gave it an entirely new life. Now you're thinking about burning this all to the ground, without even knowing how far it can go." I stared at him, my eyes narrowing. Do you hear yourself right now?" I asked. "Think about this for a moment." "I am thinking," he replied. "For the first time in 20 years, I feel like I'm thinking clearly. Marsh, I knew where that thing was. I think when it attacked me, it breathed some of its essence onto me, and it enhanced me." He paused and looked back into the inferno. No, it shared something with me. With us. I think I get it now. It didn't want food. It wanted to share something. To show us an ocean of possibilities. That's why it led us on. It wanted us to chase it so we would see, and now I see, Robert. An ocean of possibility. You should too. I stared at him, watching as his breathing grew heavier. I still clutched my gun in my hand. "I'm burning this to the ground, Gustav," I replied. "And once you get your head right, you'll agree with me that this was the right thing to do." In an instant, Gustav was on top of me. With strength that surpassed my own, he ripped my gun from my hands and forced me to the ground. No, I will not let you do that. I'll make you see," he said, grinning wide from ear to ear. "I'll make you see it, just like I see it. I'll make you see it. Come, Robert." Come into the ocean. Breathe in deep. Gustav's smile only grew wider and wider as I saw his head begin to change. His skull began to split open as that sweet stink only grew stronger. I could only stare in silent horror as I realized that there was no saving my partner. Whatever the ghoul had done to him, it had corrupted him outright. It had changed him, and now I was seeing just how much of him had been changed. In just a few hours, Gustav was no longer human, and as he prepared to unleash his payload on me, I struggled to push him off of me. I grabbed the side of his head and forced it upwards. Thick, shimmering spores drifted from his open skull, and with a scream of exertion, I threw him off of me. Gus fell towards the mine, leaving a trail of spores in his wake. Behind him, the flames were growing stronger. The mine was burning up. He climbed onto all fours, spores leaking from his skull. I watched a bone jut out of his arm like a blade, and shimmering flowers grew from the wound. If you'll not join in life, I shall have your corpse, Gustav said, his voice distorted and garbled. Like an animal, my former companion raced towards me, but I was ready for him. As he lunged for me, I ducked under him and moved towards the mine. Arrogant as ever, Gustav pursued me, still moving like a twisted animal. His skull had reformed, and his lips were curled back in a twisted smile that I will never quite forget. As I backed towards the inferno, I spotted one of the rotten supports nearby and focused back on the thing that was once Gustav. He stood up, raised the extended bone shard jutting out of his arm to try and impale me. I sidestepped him and used his own momentum to push him deeper into the mine. The flames licked at his back as I saw moments of panic in his eyes. "Marsh, wait!" he called in a voice I knew I recognized, but he wasn't going to stop me. With all my strength, I broke through the support. The rock above us shifted, and I watched as Gustav made a desperate scramble for the entrance. But I was faster. When the mine came down, I was out, but he was not. The last I heard was a desperate scream before the collapse of the mine crushed him and hopefully sent him to a peaceful rest. The DPS was quick to quarantine the area and burn the flowers, as per my request. Whatever was out there, it was too dangerous to leave unchecked. Of that I was sure. However, Gustav's loss did not sit well with me. I know that in his final moments he was not himself, and perhaps that bothered me even more than his loss. Either way, I did what I had to do. The flowers needed to be destroyed. I only hoped that we got all of them. If we didn't, well, I'd rather not think about that. Hey, what's the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? What? Togs looks at me, irritated. You heard me, pal. What's the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? I grimaced. I don't know, Togs. What is the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? He grunts with frustration and jerks his arm. The chain that binds our wrists is pulled tight, and I'm dragged over against my will. It's not a fucking joke, Rufus, Tog said to me. It's not a setup. I'm asking you, genuinely, if you happen to know. Well, I don't, I reply, jerking my arm back with a rattle of the chain. I don't know what the difference is between a graveyard and a cemetery, so why don't you just go on and tell me? He chewed his tongue. Then he spits onto the wet grass. You ain't no fun, he mutters. A graveyard is a burial grounds connected to a church. A cemetery ain't connected to nothing. It stands by itself. I wish I was a cemetery right now, I muttered. He shoves me. I heard that, Rufus. Rude bastard. Didn't ask to be chained to you any more than you asked to be chained to me. He wipes the rainwater off his free hand and onto his prison jumpsuit, then pushes his fingers through his hair. But if this is a graveyard, then we'll find the church, and the priest will have to help us. We can appeal to his sense of justice and goodwill. Priest? Do Protestant churches have priests? He'll be a minister, surely. Priest, minister, whatever. Point is, he'll be sworn to secrecy. He can help us get away, and hey, maybe absolve us of our sins in the process. It's so difficult to see the world around us. The mist is thick, more like fog, really. It stretches far and unforgivingly, in all directions, obscuring the hills we are certain must lie beyond. We've been trekking through the grim, moonlit grey of the countryside moors for most of the night, and we're tired and cold and hungry. The rain is thin and quiet as it falls, but it's been drizzling steadily for hours now, and I know that both Toggs and I could really use a little reprieve. Even if the minister's not home, a rest in an actual building would be nice. Hell, even under a tree. But we haven't seen either for miles and miles and miles. I have no idea where we are. The only sign that we've even made any progress at all since setting out are the myriad of tumbled gravestones that now lie all around us, and the faint, watchful shadows of the hills in the distance. "I told you, Toggs," I said to him. "I don't have any sins to be absolved. I'm an innocent fella, as you well know." He waves his free hand at me. Yeah, as you keep saying. If you're gonna keep insisting you're innocent, well, I don't have the energy to discuss it with you anymore." "Nothing to discuss, man," I replied. "I'm owed this escape. My freedom was taken away from me without my consent. Idiot jury and an idiot judge. Nothing more to be said." "Mm-hmm," Togg said. Then he falls quiet. We walk for a long time in silence. The gravestones stretch on, with no church in sight. "How big is this place?" I muse. "I ain't never seen no gravestone as big as this," Toggs replied. "Graveyard or cemetery?" I asked. "Neither." And the gravestones just keep going. The distance between them grows wider and they become rougher, less clearly defined. The names inscribed upon the stone became illegible. The cracks deepen. Their ages are implied in the creeping crawl of the moss, the shapes of these markers of lives gone by. As we pass them, their forms become more and more obscure. Some of the gravestones are triangular, or carved with intricate lightning-like lines. Some of the gravestones are no more than piles of grey rubble, wet and dark beneath the rain. Some of them reflect the moonlight like metal, and others appear to swallow the light altogether. "The fuck kind of place is this, Toggs?" I murmur anxiously. My body has reacted to something I can't yet put my finger on. My gut tells me that something is wrong. Rufus, check out that one." Toggs raises his hands to point, and my own arm is raised up beneath via the chain. I don't believe what I'm seeing, at first, but there's no mistake. Toggs points to a tombstone that hovers above the grass, round like a sphere. The rain flows all around it and converges at the bottom, where it trickles down like a little waterfall. Oh, holy shit. We adjust our course and walk over to it, examining the thing from all sides. Toggs even pushes on the thing, but the stone doesn't budge. It is fixed impossibly in place. And this curiosity, this bizarre anomaly, it has set my alarm bells a-ring. This isn't right. I don't think we should be here at all. And I voice this concern to Toggs. "Yeah," he mutters back, tapping his thumb against his broken nose in thought. "This is freaky, Rufus. I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. What you reckon, pal? What should we do?" "I think we should just keep going. But faster. I can't see any church, and this place is massive. It could be a war memorial or something, I'm thinking. We could spend hours looking around, not find anything at all, and there's nothing for us back the way we came. No, we should just keep moving ahead. Maybe we'll find something, maybe not, but we'll be moving forward. Tonight will be the hardest night, Toggs. It'll only get easier from here." He seems to think it over. I wait for a response, patiently. Notes that not that I have much choice, however, given our predicament. The chain jiggles softly. A lone bluebird appears from beyond the mist and settles on the zenith of the wet sphere. We look at it, and it looks back. At me, then at Toggs. Curious time for a bird to be out and about. Togs gently moves his hand a little closer to the bird and slowly sticks out one of his fingers. After a beat, and to Tog's delight, the bluebird hops onto his finger, cocking his head. "Rufus, look!" he beams, glancing up at me. "I'm looking right at you, man. I see it. I see it." The bluebird perches for a moment longer. Then it opens its beak and whistles a long, low, single note. It raises its wings and flies up and away into the fog. And as suddenly as it appeared, the bird is gone. The rain patters softly all around. "All right," said Togs quietly. "Let's keep moving." The burial grounds stretched on. The tombstones do not return to their regularity, nor do we come across any hints that they might soon be coming to an end. I was lucky enough, as a kid, to visit France with my folks. They took me to the American World War II cemetery in Normandy. The scale of the place, the death, it made an impact on me, that's for sure. But this place is bigger by far. It must be. We walk and we walk. Still, the graves keep coming. Togs keeps twitching and shooting looks over his shoulder. I don't blame him, but he's making me feel worse. I'm already on the edge, but he's sharpening it. Many of the gravestones fail to connect to the ground now. Various shapes, spheres, cones, and rectangles. One strikes up towards the sky like a dark obelisk. One sits half buried in an anomalous patch of wild grass. Marble carved to the shape of a coffin. Another looks like an angel, man-sized, with 4 outstretched wings and a blindfold over its eyes. The rain leaks down its face, and we approach the crest of a hill. "This is good," I whisper. "We'll get a vantage point over what lies ahead, fog permitting." And it does, to an extent. We come to a stop at the hill's summit and look out over the plain, wet, grassy fields below. They drop onto a valley, before rising up again towards another hill, one taller still at the opposite end. This side is quickly lost to the silver gray of the moonlit mist, as it is filled, absolutely filled, with twisted graves. The spaces between them are wide, but they are everywhere. "Lord have mercy," Togs whispers in a voice heavy with fear. Then he drops to his knees, dragging me down to a stoop as he does so, clasping his hands together in prayer and muttering to himself under his breath. I push him lightly. "What the hell are you doing, Togs? You gonna tell me you've found God now? A little too late for that, don't you think? Given all you've done." "Haven't you read the Bible, Rufus?" Togs replied, his eyes still closed. "Ain't never too late for repentance. You'd be smart to do the same and all." "I told you," I hiss. "I've got nothing to repent. I'm innocent, always have been." Togs does not reply. He only continues his prayer, and there's nothing I can do but wait. So I sit next to him and try to imagine my future life, a life in which I am free. I'll have to escape the country, that's for sure. I might head to the islands, wait until I've been long forgotten and the state decides that funds are better directed elsewhere. I imagine myself in a little wooden boat, the sun warm on my skin as I paddle leisurely across a sparkling stream to my new village. Maybe I'll help run it, or I could keep the people safe from outsiders. Maybe I could learn to fish. I shiver and wrap my free arm around my sodden chest. Icy water drips from the end of my nose. The air around me is thin and breezeless, but goosebumps ripple up my arms regardless. A rumble reverberates through the ground. I disregarded it first as a falsehood, an imagination of my mind, but the rumble comes again, heavy. "Togs," I mutter through clenched teeth. "Prayer time's over, pal. We gotta keep moving." The rumble grows more prominent. I can hear it as well as feel it now, too. Low, long thuds, echoing through the valley beyond. "Togs!" The man opens his eyes. "We gotta go, man. Come on, get up." But Togs only stares ahead, wide-eyed, and I turn to follow his gaze. And with the rumbles, A creature appears through the mist. I think it's a creature, at least. It looks like one, though it moves more like a machine. And it is colossal. A giant, shadowy silhouette in the fog, it takes slow step after slow step through the valley before us. And whilst the valley is deep, the being nonetheless stands just above our eye line, even after we've scrambled to our feet. But we can't look away. It pushes gradually into view. The being holds the form of an enormous, dark stone horse. Its eyes are spirals carved into the rock, and its feet end in curved and stony blades, slowly rising and falling on one another as it keeps moving through the valley. The churned-up, muddy holes in the grass these scythe-like hooves leave behind quickly regrow, at such a speed that we can see the grass reclaiming the wounds in real time. Neither of us move. Neither of us can. We just watch as the great horse steps closer and closer, pushing aside the mist, walking carefully between the multitude of graves. And it passes us by, silently turning its enormous stone head to look at us as it does so. We stare into those spiral eyes, and the spirals stare back, but the being does not slow. After a moment of what could surely be none other than a mild interest at best, it turns again to look in the way of the direction it is headed. On it goes, and we watch, feeling the rumbles in the ground grow fainter and fainter as it disappears once again into the fog. The rain falls, and the light flashes on the opposite side of the valley. Near the top of the long and high hill, brief but definite, a flash of orange-yellow light. Like moths, we are drawn to it. Light, warmth, fire, safety, help.
Could be them,
Togs murmurs, still in a daze.
Maybe they've caught up, found us.
Togs, I reply. Even we haven't found us. What chance do they have?
True,
he says, and we stand in silence for a moment longer, watching. The light flickers again.
What the hell was that thing, Rufus?
Togs asks quietly, turning to face me. I shake my head. Who the fuck can say? All I know for sure is that I feel like we've stumbled into something we were never meant to. I don't think we belong here, man.
No,
he agrees.
And do you feel it? When it looked at us, you feel that wave of cold, of regret?
I nodded. Dread, I muttered, and Togs nodded again.
Yeah, dread, that's it, dread. That,
he points to the flickering light.
That ain't dread. That's our way out, Rufus. Our way into a better life.
And I do believe that Togs is right. But we'll have to go through the valley, I say. We have to make it quick. I don't want that thing to come back, whatever it is. I can't be dealing with it coming back.
All right.
Togs nods and grimaces. I clap my hands together, and Togs' arm is jerked over. Let's do this, I said, and after a quick but deep breath, before I have time to psych myself out, I began to half run, half skid down the wet slope of the hill and into the valley. Togs is dragged along with me, but soon finds his balance, and down we go, slipping, skidding. We tumble into a heap at the bottom. Togs actually kept his footing at first, but I fall to the grass, and my comrade is dragged down with me. He clambers to his feet and helps me up, and we take in our surroundings. Grass and graves and mist. The valley seems wider from down here. Quickly but cautiously we began to hasten past the gravestones towards the opposite hill. They twist and bulge out at strange angles. Some are simple crosses, some are far more complex. But the names on these ones are all quite clear, and I am forced to a halt about halfway across, as Togs has chosen to stop to read one.
Togs,
I hiss, jerking his arm back via the chain.
Let's fucking go, man. I don't want to stick around here. It's her, Rufus. Look, Toggs whispers, his voice raw. I take a step closer beside him and look down at the grave. It is in the shape of a star, like one a child would draw, and connected to the ground. The name is one that we both recognize, of course. What the hell's she doing here, Rufus? How is this possible? I don't know, man. Look, let's just keep going, yeah? The light is... Tog swivels at once and grabs me by the collar, staring into my face as my hand is jerked up at an awkward angle with the chain. What the hell is she doing here? What the fuck is this place, Rufus? Jesus, I don't know, man. I don't know. Fucking let me go. I push him away with a rattle of the chain, and Toggs runs his free hand through his hair. Then he looks at it. His fingers shake. I wasn't joking either, Rufus, he says quietly. About the absolving, about the repentance. Will I ever be free? Truly free, I mean? Or is this my curse? To live like this forever? The ground rumbles. Questions for tomorrow, my man. I reply, my pulse quickening. I tug on the chain. Time to go. Now, man. Fucking now. I set off into a run, dragging Toggs behind me at first, but he quickly falls into step. The rumbles grow heavier, and we reach the base of the slope. It's steeper this time, but the light still flickers overhead, a little beacon through the mist. We scramble up side by side, dragging out clumps of mud and grass as we clumsily and desperately ascend. I see the shadow of the beast at the edge of my peripheral vision, and it spurs me up faster still. Toggs, come on! I jerk my arm up violently. The bastard is too slow. But the light is close now, and we realize that it is not one, but many. Dozens of fireflies flicker as they loop around the air above a stone archway, embedded in the hillside. A faint, silvery curtain hangs from the stone and obscures the way ahead. I shoot a glance over my shoulder. The colossal stone horse stands silently, waiting, watching. Its presence is overbearing. Looking into those spiral eyes, I feel a great pressure weighing down upon me. I do not know what this monster wants, but I can't stand it. Toggs has overtaken me. He feels the same way about the horse and about the arch, I can tell. Dread lurks behind. Hope lies beyond. Escape. And so, without a second thought, he barrels through, pushing aside the curtain and clambering into the mist ahead. My arm is jerked up behind him, and I scramble after in a quick pursuit. But I cannot pass. My knuckles crack painfully against the curtain as if it were made of rock, and I crash into the side with a cry. Toggs has vanished from sight completely, and the metal of the chain bites painfully into my wrist as he tries to continue. Toggs! I shout. Toggs, stop! Fucking stop! I can't get through! The side of my face and my shoulder are hauled up against the cold stone. And I swear, muttering and slamming my fist against the solid curtain. Toggs! I jerk my arm back as hard as I can, leveraging my feet against the base of the arch, and Toggs is dragged out against his will. The momentum is enough to see us slipping back down the hill, rain-soaked and feverish. The horse stands silently, watching. It is not far away and towers over us. What the fuck, Rufus? Toggs states angrily as we crash, bruising, back to the base. It won't let me pass. Didn't you hear me? I can't get through the fucking curtain. I throw my arms around expressively, and Toggs grunts with frustration as his own arm is thrown around too. He shoves me. What do you mean it ain't let you pass? You just go through the curtain. I can't. I shout at him, then quieter. I can't. And we stand there for a second, staring at each other at the base of the hill. The drizzle patters down all around against the grass and the wet stone of the curious graves. The enormous horse of the graveyard watches on. Toggs licks his teeth. His eyes dart up to the arch, up to the curtain that promises salvation, an escape from the world between us two unlucky souls have somewhat stumbled into. He means to leave me behind, I realize, with a strike of sudden fury. This bastard. After everything I've done for him, after I stood up for him when no one else would, he's going to leave me behind? But he can't, can he? Because of the chain. Tog's expression changes. He lets out a noise of rage, half grunt and half snarl, and he pushes his feet into the ground and yanks back his arm as hard as he can. I stumble and trip over his outstretched foot, but ultimately keep my balance and shove him into the hillside. And he shoves me back, and I slam my forehead into his own. "Asshole!" he screams, reeling back in agony. "Fuck you!" I shout into his face, and his brow contorts with rage. He pulls back his fist, the one connected to the chain, and my hand is drawn up his neck. I bring the other up, too, and rush forward, roaring with my drive for survival as I shove him to the grass by the graves, strangling the man as hard as I can. Why him? Why is it that he can pass, but I cannot? His eyes bulge in surprise. He chokes and sputters, grabbing and smacking my hands with his own, scratching, then he bares his teeth and reaches up, shoving his thumbs into his eyes. One misses and strikes the edge of the socket with a painful thud, but the other plunges deep into my eye. I reel back in pain and scream. "Go on then, bastard! Kill me! Kill me if you can! Enjoy being around my fucking corpse, you darn prick! Kill me like you killed that little girl!" Despair passed like a shadow across his face. "It was an accident, Rufus," he shouts, his voice cracking and hoarse as he forces the words through his bruised windpipe. "You know it was an accident." His fist connected with my cheek as I feel a tooth loosen in the side of my mouth with a sharp burst of pain. My own wrist is smacked across my lip as we stumble and stagger through the valley of graves. He expects me to go down, but I do not. I brace against him and punch into his stomach. The air is forced from his lungs as I grab my comrade's collar and shove him up against the nearest gravestone. Tall, cracked, and moss-covered, it rises up like a twisted flower of stone. Then why did you drive away, Togs? Why did you keep driving? Drunk off your fucking ass. Imagine if you'd hit someone else. Do you even remember? Maybe you did. He thrashes and brings a fist up into my chain. He tries to push me away, smacking the sides of his hands into my ears. I keep shouting in his face. "You don't deserve to be free. You think I even wanted to escape with you? You're a fucking menace. Togs, you dumb fuck. You're evil. You'll never get salvation." He screams and slams his head into mine over and over until I start to feel dizzy. I release him and clutch my temples, grunting as I am slamming down hard under the side of a low gravestone. "I admitted what I did was wrong, Rufus. Always. But you're a fucking liar. You ain't never been an innocent man, and you'll burn for what you did. You can't even admit it to yourself." He spits. "You're weak." "Weak?" I choke out, fighting his hands away from my neck. "You ran down your own ex-daughter because you couldn't handle a breakup like a grown man, and I'm weak? You're the one who's weak, you fucking child killer." The fight goes on. The horse seems to watch with cold curiosity, and eventually Togs has the chain wrapped around my neck. He pulls it tight with a foot against my shoulder. "Togs!" I wheezed out, scrabbling my hand around and trying to pull the chain away from his grip. White light flashes at the edge of my vision. "Togs!" I slam my hand against the grass, retching and convulsing. "Please!" And just as I think I'm about to pass out, he releases his grip, and I fall face first into the mud where I lie and gasp, sputtering and rolling onto my side, filling my lungs with the thin, wet air of the graveyard. I do not move to strike Togs back, nor does he move against me. We spend a few hours recuperating, breathing, blinking, wiping the blood from our brows. And when I finally turn to face him, he is looking up into the eyes of the great horse. It stands completely still, and in this moment it might as well be nothing more than a colossal statue. "I'm sorry, Togs," I said to him, my voice a wreck. "Me too," he replies. I don't know why the curtain doesn't let me pass. Maybe it's something about my character over yours. I don't know. And I'm sorry about what I said to you. I didn't mean it." "You were right, though, Rufus," Togs replied, wiping his eyes and running his fingers through his hair. I am what you said. I'm a child killer. And I don't. His voice breaks. I don't deserve salvation. I press my free hand against my jaw. It throbs painfully. Look, come on, Tox. You said it yourself. It's in the Bible, right? Never too late to be redeemed. I don't know if I ever really believed all that, pal, says Togs sadly. He finally turns to look at me, taking his eyes away from the spirals of the horse. Do me a favor. Come with me to the horse. He lifts his arm and the chain rattles softly. Droplets sprinkle down to the grass in the moonlight. I stare at him in alarm. You want to go closer to that thing? But, Togs. I don't know what to say. I don't understand his thought process. No, we need to keep moving. Find a way to get me past the curtain or find another way. I don't want to go through that curtain anymore, Rufus. I'm done. I'm just done. He looks behind him at the grave in the shape of a shooting star, the one carved like a child's drawing. Togs. My voice is quiet. Buddy, come on, man. Please. Just come with me to the horse, Rufus. You still feel the same way about it, don't you? The dread. I get that. And I'm sorry. But I don't. I see now. Come on, pal. Walk with me. And after a moment of silence, I rise to my feet, grunting through the pain, and the chain clinks as we walk to the nearest of the horse's legs. My pulse rises, and I try to keep from looking directly at it, but Togs strides forward, unafraid. Thanks for helping me out, Rufus, he says to me. The rain washes the blood down the side of his face. I hope you get the freedom you deserve one day. I really, genuinely do. And he puts a hand on the horse's enormous, scythe-like stone leg. I watch as Togs evaporates as a cloud of dust into the air. With nothing more than a soft sigh, his essence leaves his body, and his flesh dissolves at once like steam. Only his bones are left behind, and they collapse into a pile at the base of the horse's leg. I stare in disbelief as the loose end of the chain drops through the air to bump up against my leg. The bones clatter to join their fellows. Togs, I whisper, and the horse moves. It raises its leg, slowly, and then the other. It turns into a wide circle, and mechanically ambles away into the fog, fading into shadow, then disappearing altogether in the silver gray. I made it out of the valley eventually, reader. The death of Togs hit me harder than I would have expected, especially given not 15 minutes earlier I had felt prepared to kill the man myself. Not that I think I would have actually done it, however. There is enough blood on my hands. But it took me a long time to get out, I mean. The sun never rose, the rain never let up, and despite my best efforts, I could not pass the curtain. I just couldn't. I just couldn't do it. I searched the valley for hour after hour. I drank the water that condensed on the grass. For days I climbed the hills and hunted for a sign of escape, but I was always led back to the valley. It was not until I had burned Tog's bones that I was able to pass through the archway in the side of the hill. Beneath the flickering fireflies, I remember turning around one last time, watching as a gravestone grew out of the spot in which I had burned him. It carved and formed itself into the shape of a little bird, about to take flight from its perch upon the branch of a small stone tree. And so I left the valley. I escaped. I fled the country as I said I would. I made it to the islands, and I've been here for months now, keeping as low a profile as I can. But there's one thing that remains from my past life. The chain. That damned chain. Empty at one shackle, of course, but still tightly affixed around my wrist on the other. I cannot get it off. I cannot get it unlocked, nor can I cut through it, no matter what I do or try. And sometimes, I swear, especially at night, it is almost like I can feel someone tugging at the other end.
Ever since I was a young child, I've been fascinated by the supernatural. I read every book, watched every documentary, and collected any articles I could involving ghosts, spirits, demons, or other ethereal entities. I'd never really considered the religious implications of such fascinations, and I certainly didn't know if there was a heaven or a hell, but I knew there were ghosts. After high school, I went on the road, searching for anything and everything that might give me the opportunity to witness a haunting. I'd been through small towns, big cities, north, south, east, and west, working odds and ends jobs whenever I ran out of money, living hand to mouth, and never giving up. But I had to be honest, I'm starting to lose hope. I'd recently arrived in a suburb outside of Boston. The local newspapers were all reporting about a particularly heinous home invasion, ending in the death of a man, a woman, and their young child. A part of the house, the master bedroom, had been burned from the inside, but first responders managed to quell the flames before the house was destroyed. They were too late to save any of the family, though. It was perfect. As morbid as this sounds, this had everything. A young child, happy family, fire, home invasion, so potentially vengeful spirits. So many factors that could add up to a restless spirit lingering in this world, not quite ready to let go and move on to whatever comes after. Driving past the house, it was apparent that this had happened recently. Smoke still gently leaked from a window near the back of the house, and the area still buzzed with reporters and law enforcement personnel. The property itself was still taped off. I decided to start my search away from the house. I wouldn't be able to get anywhere near an active crime scene, plus any details I'd need would be made available once the investigation was complete. I wasn't in any kind of hurry. I went first to the house's backyard neighbor. They would have been closest to the room that was set aflame, and might have seen or heard something. When I knocked on their door, an older gentleman answered the door. He looked probably 55 to 60 and had a kind face, but was visibly shaken.
Yes,
the man said, peering around the door timidly. Good afternoon, sir. My name's Paul Harrison. I'm an independent journalist. I was hoping you might answer a few questions, I stated, while producing a fake press pass. I wouldn't have fooled anyone who knew what they were looking at, but it was convincing enough for those who didn't. He let out an exacerbated sigh before saying,
Sure, come on in.
It was fairly clear I wasn't the first to come knocking. He led me to the living room where he offered me a seat on the couch. I retrieved my journal from my bag and scribbled the date, time, and location. What is your name, sir?
Michael. Michael Foster.
Okay, Mr. Foster. First, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I'm sure you've had numerous people come asking already. He nodded once, slowly, remained silent. Did you know the family behind your house?
Not well, but we spoke once or twice. I only saw them occasionally while I was tending my garden. Their daughter would play in the backyard every now and then while the weather was nice. She'd always smile and wave at me. Seemed like a very sweet young girl.
I nodded as I wrote. Go on, I added without looking up. He paused, as if he didn't quite know what to say. How about the parents? Did you ever speak with them?
Only once. They were grilling some steaks for dinner one evening while I was sitting out back. We exchanged pleasantries and made a bit of small talk, but that was it. They seemed friendly enough, seeming like generally nice people. I couldn't tell you much more, though.
That's all right. How about the night of the fire? What can you tell me about that? The man hesitated for a moment before continuing. I woke up in the middle of the evening to screaming. I'm a fairly light sleeper. It startled me awake. It wasn't one scream, but many, and continuous. I went to my kitchen window, just through there, he said as he pointed through a doorway into his living room to a large window overlooking his backyard. From there, I could see flames in front of the second story, on the right side of the house. The screaming continued as the flames blew out the window and started billowing out. They went on for a minute or two, it seemed. I called 911 as soon as I saw what was happening, but the screaming stopped before anyone arrived. The fire department arrived minutes later, but I think that someone burned alive in that room. The man's voice trailed off after his last sentence. I'm so sorry, Mr. Foster. That must have been terrible. I can't even imagine. Do you know what could have started the fire? The police are saying it was a break-in or something. I just don't understand why someone would need to set the place on fire. Did you see anyone leaving? Anybody running away or a car driving off? No, but I wasn't looking. I couldn't look away from that window. I wanted to so badly, but I couldn't. I'm very sorry, Mr. Foster. Is there anything you've witnessed out of the ordinary in the days since? What exactly do you mean? What could possibly be considered out of the ordinary in a house that a family was just murdered in only days ago? I understand how this could be a bizarre question. I'm referring to things that shouldn't be happening. Lights flickering on and off in the middle of the night, strange sounds, more screaming, anything of that sort. I was trying not to seem too enthusiastic as I elaborated. Evidently, I failed. No, of course not. What kind of journalist are you, exactly? Well, sir, I investigate the paranormal, and based on the grotesque nature of... You gotta be kidding me, the man yelled, standing up from his seat. A family was murdered, and they're not even in the ground before you come asking about ghosts. Have you some damn respect? I'm sorry, sir. Get the hell out of my house. I've got nothing more to say to you. The man fumed. Right. Once again, I'm very sorry, I said as I hurried to the door. Mr. Foster said nothing more, but slammed the door behind me. I tried a couple more of the neighbors, but they all said the same thing. Screams, flames, and didn't see anyone leaving. This might just be what I've been looking for. I decided to spend a couple of nights outside the house, parked a few houses over. I couldn't go inside since it was still an active crime scene, so that would be as close as I could get. I arrived just before dusk with the usual stuff. Caffeine, snacks, binoculars, night vision, and a long-distance microphone. It wasn't my first rodeo. Well, then again, maybe it was, since it's never actually worked before. But that's not the point. All the internet sites said this was the best stuff. Plus, it cost me a year's worth of bussing tables to afford some of it. Shaking myself out of my unrelated train of thought, I settled in for a long night. After about 4 hours of waiting and seeing absolutely nothing, my eyes began to droop. I was bored, tired, and getting frustrated. But I had to remind myself it could take a long time. The family had just died. It could take years before they revealed themselves in that house. I looked down at my phone and started browsing some different ghost hunting forums to reinvigorate my passion. I scrolled through a couple of pages, wondering what it was that they'd been doing differently, when I noticed a flicker out of my peripheral vision. I looked up, but saw nothing. I felt my adrenaline peak, then slowly wane as I got that sinking feeling that I'd just been seeing things. That is, until I saw it again. This time while staring right at it. Only for a split second, but it was clear as day. The lights in one of the upstairs rooms had flickered on and off again. This is it, I thought to myself. After all these years, I was staring at a haunted house. I pointed the microphone right at the room and listened intently. I heard something so faint I couldn't tell if I imagined it or not. I turned my head left and away so that my ear was pressed up against the microphone. I listened and listened, but couldn't hear anything. As I gave up and turned my head back towards the house, I threw the microphone straight up into the roof of my car. The light in the room wasn't on, but it was completely aflame. Standing at the window, engulfed in flames, was the family. The mother and father stood directly behind their daughter, who stood between them with their hands on her shoulders, almost like an old-time family portrait. I scrambled for my binoculars, bringing them up to my eyes without ever looking away. As soon as my eyes came into focus, I realized it. They were all three, staring straight at me. I jolted awake, dropping my phone, which had been in my lap, on the floor of my car. My head snapped to the window of the house, but there was nothing. "No!" I shouted as I slammed the steering wheel, completely and utterly exacerbated and discouraged. I didn't want to believe I'd fallen asleep and dreamt the whole thing, but the longer I stared, the more I realized that that's exactly what happened. I drove back to my rundown hotel room and detailed the events in my journal, including the dream. Then I called it a night. I went back every night for a week, seeing nothing more eventful than a spooky dream. I was starting to think that this might not be as perfect as I thought it was, until the newspaper started releasing more details, eventually including lines from the police report. While originally deemed to be a break-in gone wrong, police suspect the brutal murder of family of three has more to it. Well, that certainly got my attention. I read on. Police have been unable to identify any items taken during the home invasion, with many valuables still left behind. Additionally, it appears the attacker, or attackers, made no attempt to search the premises at all. What was the purpose for the attack? The hairs on the back of my neck were standing straight up at this point. I immediately hopped on my phone, Googling anything and everything I could think of regarding this incident. As I had expected, conspiracy theorists, occult followers, ghost hunters, and deep web nuts of all kinds were jumping on it, each proposing their own explanation. Was the seemingly sweet and normal suburban family hiding something? Was it a random act of unspeakable violence? Could it have been a cult ritual? Of course, this kind of thing attracts tons of, people like me. If others were thinking it, I might not be wrong after all. I decided I was in this one for the long haul. I got a part-time job tending a bar, which interfered with my pursuit at times, but I had to pay the bills somehow. I saved up some money and moved into a nice couple's extra room. It wasn't much, but the rent was cheap and they kept to themselves. Eventually, the house was cleaned as a crime scene and put up for sale. In the months that it was on the market, I learned everything I could about the place. The realtors had an alarm installed since it sat empty for so long, but it didn't take more than a few minutes on the internet to figure out ways around that. I spent so many nights investigating the house, setting video recorders, sound recorders, and sweeping with UV lights. I learned which stairs would creak, which doors were squeaky, and which windows were loose. I learned the attic was generally colder than the rest of the house, and I memorized the room with the fire. It didn't look the same as the pictures. I knew it had been remodeled, but I committed every detail to memory. I walked through the room, hoping to feel any kind of chill in the air, any kind of agitated presence. I laid on the floor and screamed as loud as I could. I begged, pleaded, and taunted, hoping to elicit any kind of response. But I still saw nothing, heard nothing, and felt nothing. After about 7 months of trying and failing, I realized the missing piece. As I drove up to the house one evening, I noticed the for sale sign had been taken down. At first, I panicked. With a family moving into the home, I wouldn't have the access that I needed to the house. It had become my obsession, my religion, my addiction. I needed this house to be the one. But then it dawned on me, and hope sparkled once more. The house was never haunted, because the spirits had never felt threatened. They never saw their home invaded, turned someone else's. With a family moving in, and the cameras and microphones already existing in the house, this would be the perfect opportunity to observe the area without anyone's knowledge, as it slowly drew the ghosts of this family into despair and back into the real world. The new family that moved in seemed idyllic. A relatively young couple, early 30s, and 2 young children, a girl and a boy. I don't know much about kids, but they both seem younger than 10. They ate their meals together, they had family game nights, and they all seemed to love each other very much. Especially the man and the woman. They made love almost every night. At first, I tried not to watch, but the thought that perhaps such an act would draw a spirit out captivated me, and I would be glued to the screen the entire time, watching from the edge of my seat. I didn't enter the house too much, at least not at first. But as I watched the family and learned their habits, their schedules, and their lives, I realized there was still so much information I needed, so much data my journal was still missing. I usually waited until they left the house, but I started becoming irritable, impatient. I needed results. And in the end, I got reckless. It all came crashing down when I risked too much. I had to see the room again. I had to feel a presence. I knew it was there. When I walked in the room, they were asleep. When she stirred, I didn't think she'd woken up, but she was just frozen. Then she started screaming, so loud and terrible. I wasn't trying to scare her, I promise. As she grasped for her husband, I plummeted into fight or flight. I've never ran so fast in my life. Down the stairs to the front door. As I burst through, the alarm went off, but I didn't care. I knew it was over. Everything I'd worked for. As I started my car and peeled away, I looked back one last time, watching lights all through the house turn on. I may have imagined it, but for a fraction of a second, a glimpse as I looked away, I thought I saw the family of 3, posing for their portrait in the same window I'd seen all those months ago. I knew I had to leave town. I knew I couldn't ever go back. They'd find the cameras, they'd find my fingerprints. It was all over the house. They would know what I did, what I'd been doing. It was all over. I had to move on, but I hadn't given up. I've never seen a ghost, but I know I'll find one. At a rest stop about 30 miles outside of town, I stopped to make one last journal entry before I left this case behind forever and got back on the road. Fire didn't work. Next time, I'll try drowning them. It was supposed to just be a meme. That's what everyone at the precinct thought when it first started. All inside jokes to the entertainment of some fringe internet community with macabre senses of humor and too much time on their hands. But then people started dying, and we realized it was something much more. Osira is something much more. Maybe you've heard that name before, or maybe you haven't. There have been a few accounts of rather unfortunate individuals and their interactions with this being posted to the internet. We thought they were fiction, but the similarities can no longer be ignored. In early 2020, we first became aware of a clandestine internet clique known as the Pupils of Osira. They seemed pretty asinine,
just an odd community that operated mostly on the hidden part of the internet, known colloquially to most as the dark web. Pupils of Osira. Their acronym literally spells out poo, and the members are all too aware and seem to find a great deal of humor in that. Like I said, it all seemed like just weird kids being weird kids. So maybe you can understand why we didn't exactly take them seriously when we first discovered them. The whole premise of their group seemed to just be worshipping and try to gain the praise of their deity known as Osira. She was this anime, streamer, internet person that was touted as the goddess of chaos, and her followers dispersed that lore far and wide. The internet is a weird place, and I am a 46-year-old former cop. I won't pretend to understand the nuances and inner workings of those communities the way the younger generation does, and clearly, that was our downfall. The first case linked to its phenomena was during May of 2020. The body of a man was found in a back alley, but his death was unusually gruesome. Rather than just being shot or stabbed, this dude had his skull caved in from an apparent curb stomp. If any of you had seen the movie American History X, it was almost identical to that infamous scene. As it turns out, the victim was a registered sex offender. He spent about a decade in prison after diddling some kid back in '03. I don't exactly have much sympathy for him, if I'm being honest, and clearly whoever executed him didn't either. The crime was sadistic and brutal in a way that was clearly more than just a robbery or assault gone wrong. Whoever did it wanted to send a message. That message became clear when the video of the murder itself popped up online a few days later. Several different websites uploaded the video. Dailymotion, LiveLeak, Best Gore, and Rotten being among them. All of which removed it after being subpoenaed and threatened with charges for interfering with an ongoing case. I have no doubt that it's still out there, though. After swabbing the scene of the crime and watching that damn video for more times than I can count, we managed to identify a suspect. The man the evidence suggested didn't exactly seem like a likely candidate at first. He was a welder in the oil field, a family man with 2 young children and a squeaky clean criminal history. He made good money, but had been laying off when the pandemic lockdowns began. Despite that, he seems to be doing just fine financially. He had no relation to the victim's previous victim either, and really didn't seem the type to commit such a ruthless crime. We brought him in for questioning and were simply dumbfounded when he admitted to the crime with minimal prodding. He appeared almost proud of what he had done, and that really threw us for a loop. When asked why he did it, he simply smiled and gave a cryptic response. "Osira decreed it." Me and my partner, Keller, exchanged a confused glance. "Who is that?" Keller asked. The man chuckled and shook his head. "She is life and freedom, love and death, and everything in between." The man refused to elaborate beyond that vague response, and showed zero sympathy for his actions. "He was a chomo, so who cares?" he said, grinning. Something about his eyes was unnerving to behold. I've interviewed thousands of people accused of all sorts of things, and at this point I'm not easily rattled. But I'd be lying if I said that interaction didn't unsettle me a bit. The look in his eye was like some manic animal, a zealot who felt his actions brought him salvation. It was mostly concerning to us, because, like I said, this guy had absolutely no criminal history beforehand, not even a damn parking ticket on his record. Throughout the entire interrogation, he gave no indication of a motive beyond his initial response. He also vehemently refused to reveal her to us. Keller and I finally gave up about 2 hours later, but before we left, the man gave one final cryptic response. "She's watching you." His malicious grin seemed to further elongate when he said it. Keller and I left, now with a distinct feeling that, whatever this was, it was only the beginning. Sometime later, we managed to track down the domain in which the pupils operated. Sure enough, that video was on there as well. The other users seemed pleased with it, and congratulated the original poster on a job well done. By this point, we realized we were dealing with some sort of extremist network. Their website was pretty remedial, just a basic forum with users posting text and pictures, reminiscent of 4chan, but with users who went by registered pseudonyms. I managed to engage a user who went by the name of Dunkleosteus on there, and he revealed a few things to me. It was he or she that revealed this Osira was a goddess of chaos, a being from beyond our world who had come to save us. His words, not mine. The users on the forum seemed like an odd mix of internet trolls and religious fanatics, like they had long since huffed their own bullshit and gotten high off the fumes. I hear the word kids use for it nowadays is simp, but these guys took that concept to a whole new level. Our precinct was eventually contacted by the FBI after we made it known that we had discovered their website. They didn't tell us much, but the site was shut down not long after. I voiced my displeasure with that decision, arguing that we could learn more from them. On the other hand, the fact the FBI was suddenly involved meant this thing was much bigger than just one psychopath and one murderer. When they shut down the pupils' website, they didn't scatter the roaches, they just turned off our spotlight. I knew this was a bad decision, and not even a week later, it was proven correct when someone tried planting a pipe bomb near a local prison. Thankfully, it was found and dismantled before going off, and the person responsible was arrested. To our surprise, the wannabe bomber was a young woman in her mid-20s. She worked at a local university as a chemist. We assumed that was how she got her hands on the materials used to create her bomb, but we still didn't understand why. We all had thought the Pupils Forum was mostly a community of young men who were angry with the world and didn't know how to vent their frustrations. But once again, we had to circle back. Both our suspects were rather successful and had a lot to lose by doing what they did. We didn't understand what possessed these otherwise successful and happy people to suddenly commit or attempt to commit such violent crimes. Much to our chagrin, our interview with her didn't tell us much. She altogether refused to give a reason as to why she had done it, and again seemed entirely unconcerned with her own well-being. She didn't even give any indication she had ties with the pupils of Osira, at least until the end. Keller and I gave up after about an hour, and as we were leaving the room, the woman said something which caused us to pause. "Would you like to meet her?" I turned and glared at the woman, not understanding what she was insinuating. Who?" I asked. "Osira," she responded simply. I tried to contain my surprise at the mention, but the woman smirked, and I could tell she knew. "You could arrange that?" Keller asked. "Not you. You're a lost cause." The woman snarled back at him, and returned her gaze to me. I didn't understand what she meant by that, and she didn't clarify. "She'll visit you in your dreams." The woman cracked an unnerving smile, and Keller and I just left, believing the woman was insane. By that point, we thought we were dealing with some New Age cult or terrorist network that worshipped some sort of dark goddess, and we didn't really know what to do with that information. They don't teach you much about how to deal with cults in the academy, but we had the feeling we were about to get a crash course. That night, as I was settling in for bed, I found the woman's words echoing in my mind. Of course, I believed she was delusional, and her words were just an empty threat to rattle me. But it worked. I then found myself walking through a forest, confused and disoriented with no memory how I got there. I felt as though I was being watched, and each time I turned my head, I saw shadows scuttle away behind trees. I kept moving away from them, feeling as though they were driving me towards something. Not long after, I arrived at a grove, and was presented with 3 separate, unnerving sights. All 3 of them were set out as if they were some macabre theater acts. like they were set up explicitly for me to see. The first showed a young girl tied to a chair, with about a dozen shadowy people around her. Their shoes were bright red, and they wore fine tailored suits, but their faces were concealed with unsettling masks in the likeness of various animals like goats, ravens, and rabbits. The young girl wore a pearly white dress with a trail of blood running down her chest. Her mouth was gagged, and tears shimmered down her cheeks. To the right of that morbid scene, I saw a field of wilted flowers and crumbling buildings. Piles of burning wreckage and hundreds of corpses littered the fields. A man in a gas mask then entered, tossing a body onto one of the pyres before he looked in my direction. I looked away. There was no blood or gore in the third scene. No inferred child abuse. It was far more subtly unnerving. It was 4 people. 1 man, 1 woman, 1 girl, and 1 boy. They wore these gray coveralls, like pajama sets, but without any fancy decorations. They just stood there, staring at me, with faces devoid of emotion, thought, or humanity. All of them then spoke in unison. "Now we are free." I backed away, feeling a permeated sense of horror seep into the very fibers of my mind. As disturbing as all these scenes were, when I turned back, I saw something much worse. A young girl, blonde hair and blue eyes, stood behind me. An ornate mask covered her face, but her clothes appeared normal, and even almost familiar. She slowly lifted her hands and removed the mask, and my heart fell to my toes. It was my daughter, Chelsea. I could feel the tears running down my cheeks. I wanted to rush and hug her, but I was frozen in place. She smiled and uttered 2 simple words.
"Find them."
I lurched up in my bed, soaked with sweat and breathing frantically. I was partially relieved that the horrible things I just witnessed were only a dream, but it was far beyond that. I've had nightmares before. Most people probably have, but that dream was the single most visceral experience I've ever beheld. It was almost as if it wasn't a dream at all, but a vision of a potential eventuality. Chelsea, my beloved daughter, was taken from us almost 12 years ago now. She was at a friend's house when someone abducted her. There was a grueling and frantic investigation, but nothing ever came of it. No one ever found her or even a culprit. And I'll never forgive myself for it. It was the main reason I became a cop, to be honest. And the vision of her seemed more than coincidence. Maybe she's still alive, after all. That anxiety lingered for the rest of that day, and I decided it was well past time to learn more about Osira. That was easier said than done, though, and I found very little information online anywhere. No mentions of her, no fictional works or excerpts from ancient cursed tomes. A part of me thought I was just being taken for a ride, but another, more prominent part of me knew those dreams were too significant to be ignored. I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole then, I won't lie, and I spent days following the trail and the things I saw in my dreams. Our police chief wanted to just close the case out, figuring since we had apprehended those responsible that it was over. But I knew it wasn't. I knew that whatever was happening, this was only the beginning. I was proven right about a week later, when a series of videos emerged on the social media platform known as TikTok. The person who posted them was a teenage boy, and he believed he had recorded proof of a poltergeist. The series of videos detailed he and the 2 of his friends using a Ouija board to try and speak with it. Eventually, it told them its name, Osira. The 3 kids asked her a multitude of questions, receiving bizarre and cryptic answers. If what they were told was true, then we can assume that this Osira, whatever she was, is very old, ancient even. She's demonstrated familiarity with multiple languages and revealed knowledge that others weren't privy to. The last video the kid posted was unlike the others. The video was filled with static and seemed to stutter like an old VCR cassette that had been damaged. Something that shouldn't really happen, considering the kid had presumably recorded the video on his phone. It just showed him filming his dark room, slowly panning back and forth for about 30 seconds as static struck the screen over and over. The kid then spoke in a whisper. "She needs us." The video then ended, and the user hadn't posted anything new since. I did some follow-up and made a disturbing discovery not long after. The original video was posted by a kid named Zach, and he and his family had made the news. His brother, Jake, was in police custody, being charged for first-degree assault of a police officer. It was the same Jake who had appeared in Zach's video. I contacted the precinct that had him in custody and got the story from them after I informed them it may be related to another case. Apparently, 2 of their officers had been called to Jake and Zach's residence after their mother had called for an ambulance for Jake. Jake was apparently catatonic, and they thought he might be having a medical emergency. Zach and his mother greeted the 2 officers at the door. Then, without warning, Jake suddenly leapt down from the 2nd story. He beat the snot out of one of the officers, before being eventually subdued by the other. The officer he attacked is currently comatose, having received a broken jaw, eye socket, losing about a dozen teeth, and suffering severe cranial hemorrhaging from the vicious and seemingly unprompted attack. Doctors aren't sure if he'll ever wake up. Zach had posted his story to the internet. He made the claim that other users on TikTok were claiming to have interacted with Osira as well. I didn't and still don't know if all those claims were genuine, but it was too big to ignore. After getting the half-assed approval of my chief, Keller and I flew out to try and interrogate the people involved. Keller wasn't thrilled about it either, and in his mind, this case was already over. Once we landed a few hours later, we went straight to the station where Jake was being held. One of their officers led us into the interrogation room, and soon after, Jake was led in handcuffs. He looked like a normal kid by all accounts, but he had this dazed look in his eye, like his mind was far from the present. It was probably the most pointless interrogation I've ever conducted, because the kid literally didn't say a single word to us, no matter what we asked him. He refused to even make eye contact. I kept wondering whether he had suddenly been afflicted with some mental illness, which I'm sure could account for his violent assaults and lack of communication. Not that it would exonerate him, but checking his records indicated nothing of the sort aside from mild depression. We soon gave up after realizing he wasn't going to tell us anything, and decided to turn our attention to his brother. We got in touch with him, and he agreed to meet us at a local diner. Since it's a lockdown, we had to eat outside in less than ideal weather, but it was really the only choice we had. Zach arrived a few minutes after we did, and thankfully was much more vocal than his incarcerated brother. He greeted us, but oddly enough, before we could introduce ourselves, he cut us off. "You're Greg Watkins," he then turned to Keller. "And you're Ben Keller." It caught me off guard, but I realized I had told him my name over the phone, but I hadn't told him Keller's. He sat down at our table and ordered a coffee, and I decided to just glance over how he knew us already. We asked him to explain exactly what happens to him, and I told him to please give us the truth, no matter how ridiculous it may have seemed. He did exactly that, telling us the story of how he and his 2 friends communicated with Osira. Keller didn't seem to be buying it, but I wanted him to continue, even if this was some elaborate ruse. "Why do you think she chose you?" I asked. Keller gave me an odd glance, and Zach sighed. "She knows people. She speaks to the hatred in the hearts of people." That was not the response I expected, though it got me intrigued. I asked him to elaborate. "You know you felt it too, when you look around all the atrocities in our world, all the injustice, cruelty, crimes against humanity. He then looked me dead in the eye, and I felt chills roll down my spine. It's the secret desire all people possess. Some ignore it, others kindle it, and others are utterly consumed by it. The desire to just burn it all down and start over, to destroy in order to create. When the system is so completely filled with corruption, it seems like the only thing they can do. Keller and I exchanged a glance, but said nothing. That was a much more profound and disturbing answer than I anticipated. "You don't seem like the hateful type," I commented, and Zach shook his head. "I'm really not. I'm as concerned with the state of the world as anyone, but I don't think violence can be the solution. People have tried that before, and it only leads to more misery." He trailed off, and I asked him another question. "Is Jake that way?" Zach sighed, and seemed hesitant to respond, so I decided to assure him. "Zach, whatever you tell us here will not affect your brother's case in any way. We don't want anyone else to get hurt." Zach then scoffed, like he didn't believe me. "It's not up to you. People are going to get hurt, people are going to die, and things are going to change." It almost felt like he was suddenly making a threat, and I almost regretted my previous statement. He then looked me in the eye once more, with a deadpan stare. "You can't stop Osira. You can only pick a side." He then got up, dropped a $5 bill on the table, and left, despite my pleas for him to tell us more. We had nothing to charge him with, so legally, we couldn't keep him there. All we could do was watch him walk off, and scratch our heads. Keller and I argued after that, and he refused to believe anything Zach told us was real. He said the kid was just pulling a hoax, or eccentric, and there was no way that any of the Osira thing was legitimate. Part of me wanted to believe him, but I couldn't ignore the body count. We went back to our hotel, with the intention of flying home the following day. That night, I found myself wondering why Zach even agreed to meet with us if he didn't bother telling us anything. He didn't even try defending his brother, so it didn't make much sense. I then remembered how he knew us before we arrived. It seems as though Osira chooses her victims or acolytes deliberately, and after the dreams I had, I wonder if maybe she'd chosen us as well. I looped back and found myself inspecting the last video Zach had posted on his TikTok. I must have watched that thing a dozen times that night, before something finally clicked. The static wasn't random. It seemed inserted intentionally at specific intervals, almost like it was trying to send a message. The static reverberated in almost rhythmic patterns, and after writing them down, I began to realize something. This Osira seemed to enjoy riddles and coded messages, and after noting the timestamps on the video and translating the static into binary, I found myself with a series of seemingly nonsensical numbers. It was late into the night when I finally managed to organize them into a pattern that made sense. The resulting findings left me with a series of coordinates and no context. After punching them in, I found the spot indicated was only about a 2-hour drive north. I didn't know what it was leading to, but I knew I had to follow it. Keller was understandably not convinced by my findings. He was the senior of our duo, and had told me that in his years of experience, hunches didn't account for much, and that was essentially all I had. I ended up making him a deal to stick around with me, and begrudgingly, he agreed to go with me. So the two of us evaded our flight home and instead drove 2 hours north. Once we arrived at the spot, I began to feel as though it was all a waste of time, as the area we found was just an empty grove. Since we'd driven all that way, I figured the least we could do was follow the coordinates down to a T. We got out of the car and entered the field, following the map further and further into the grove. Soon enough, we arrived at the exact spot and found a whole lot of nothing. It was just a dirt patch. Keller sighed. "Hey, don't worry about it. Sometimes your gut can be wrong." He put a hand on my shoulder. Come on, let's go home. He turned to leave, and as soon as his foot left the dirt, it disturbed the soil. Something about it was wrong, like in the way the dirt rested. It almost looked as though someone had recently been digging out there. I dropped to the ground and began clawing at the dirt. Keller looked at me like I was a lunatic, but after clearing only a few handfuls, a few strands became visible. Golden threads like some type of hair. I dug away another couple handfuls and more of it emerged. I then grabbed another handful, and as I pulled it back, I found a face staring back at me. I fell backwards, utterly shocked and horrified by what I'd just found. Oh shit. I'll get back up. Don't touch anything, Keller barked, breaking into a sprint back to our rental car. I just stared at the morbid scene, transfixed by terror. A young girl, her body rotted and flesh riddled with worms. Her body dumped in a shallow grave as if it were no more than trash. A forensic team arrived an hour or two later and began the arduous process of extracting the victim. It only took them a few minutes to realize the young girl wasn't alone in the shallow grave. Over the next 2 days, the team uncovered the remains of at least 26 corpses, all of them children aged between 5 and 16 years old. In all my time as a cop, I'd never seen anything so horrific. The young girl I found turned out to be a 12-year-old who went missing back in 2019. I personally called her father to inform her we'd found his daughter. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of his sobs when I told him. As horrific as it was, there was something potentially worse. That young girl we found was the same one I'd seen in my dream. I'd bet my life on it. Keller thought the followers of Osira were responsible for it, but that didn't make much sense to me. If it was them, then why would they lead us directly to the victims? Perhaps they wanted to gloat, but that didn't seem to line up with what Osira claimed to be. A goddess of vengeance, a being of chaos. Obviously, cults are known for human sacrifices, but something about it didn't add up. The coroner's report a few weeks later would discover they had all died of the same affliction. Their radial arteries had been slit by a blade in both wrists, along with the carotid artery in their necks. The majority of them also suffered bruising that seemed to indicate sexual battery, but because of the state of their corpses, it was inconclusive. I took the information back to our police chief, expecting him to be equally as disturbed by our discoveries as I was. If I'm allowed to be selfish for a moment, I also expected to be commended for my work, but none of that happened. The chief examined the countless photographs on his desk before, as both Keller and I waited with bated breath. After a few minutes of silence, he finally sighed and removed his glasses. I've seen this type of work before. His response caught me off guard, but I said nothing, hoping he would continue. He looked to Keller, then over to me. I need you both to never speak of this again. Keller and I looked at one another, both in utter bewilderment. What? Sir, this case is huge. Someone's abducting and murdering children. Yes, I'm aware of that, Officer Watkins. He cut me off mid-sentence, but I didn't understand. He just remained silent for a moment, as if debating with himself about something which deeply disturbed him. Look, I can't tell you everything. I can only say that this is something we were never supposed to find. It must remain a secret. I shot up from my seat, incensed by his suggestion. I did my best to temper my fury before speaking. Sir, with all due respect, that is an absolute travesty. How many parents out there are wondering what happened to their children? Someone is doing this and needs to be stopped. How could there possibly be anything more important than the safety of our kids? The chief shot a mournful glance at me, well aware of the tragedy of my daughter and how I had inadvertently inserted myself into the equation. Because there are things going on here that you do not understand, that I don't understand. People and things much more powerful than you or I. All I know is what I'm told. And what I'm told is that this incident, and all others like it, never happened. I need both of you to forget it." I felt my hands clenched into white-knuckled fists as he finished, unable to even believe what he was saying. The biggest case of my entire career by a country mile, and my own police chief was telling me to just pretend it never happened. "I'm sorry." I just stared at him as he said it, and I saw it. The look of deep sorrow mixed with a permeated terror that was rife in his expression. The fear was so thick in his demeanor you could practically smell it. I just stormed out of his office after that. He's a coward, and anyone who willingly allows children to suffer, be tortured, and die is no better as far as I'm concerned. Consequences be damned. And screw who or whatever it is that has scared him to silence. It couldn't end there. I wouldn't let it. Keller took our orders far better than I did, and all but forgot about the morbid discovery. On the surface, I did the same, walking and quacking like another federal duck. I never saw any mention of our discovery in the news either, and it simply faded into myth. I never stopped looking into it, though. Weeks went by, and things returned mostly to normal. Keller and I returned to pursuing small-time drug dealers and pimps, while the horrific knowledge of our previous case gnawed endlessly at my mind. I had become obsessed, I'll admit that. But because of the chief's orders, I couldn't even confide in my own partner anymore. I continued having dreams every bit as horrific as my first, but with details far too numerous and intricate to fully describe here. This is already getting long, and I apologize for that, but I've saved the most important discovery for the end. Keller insisted on coming over one night after work to have a few drinks. He'd no doubt sensed me distancing myself, and obviously wanted to let off some steam. I didn't much feel like it, but after his relentless insistence, I finally agreed. Keller prattled on about sports and gossip as we arrived back in my apartment, and I did my best to find interest. I unlocked my apartment door, and the two of us stepped inside. My door seemed looser than normal, and as I closed it behind us, I realized why. There was a man in my apartment, aiming a pistol at us. "Close the door," he commanded. I did as requested. He then motioned to my counter. "Phones and guns. Try anything funny and you die." Clearly, he wasn't messing around. He didn't appear to be there to rob me. Keller and I followed instructions. He then ordered us to sit on my couch, and again, we followed. The lights were still off in my apartment, and I only got minimal glimpses of the guy's face under his hood, but I could swear I'd seen him somewhere before. After Keller and I took our seats, he sat in the opposite chair, keeping the pistol aimed towards us. "You weren't supposed to be here tonight, but I can work with that," he said, leering at Keller. "Who are you? What do you want?" Keller asked, as the man flicked on the lamp between us. The moment he did, I realized I knew who he was. "He's Ethan, Zach's missing friend," I answered. Keller glanced worryingly at me, and Ethan smirked. "That's right, though clearly not missing anymore." His smile grew wider as he said it. "I'm going to make this simple, gentlemen. I need the address to Marvin Hoogland." Keller and I exchanged a worried glance. "The chief? Why?" Keller asked. "'Cause I want to send him flowers," Ethan replied, sarcastically, with a deadpan glare. Keller and I remained silent as I tried developing a plan to draw my sidearm. A snub-nosed revolver, my concealed carry. The precinct would have a fit if they knew I always carried it, but they didn't know that. And in that moment, I was never so glad to have it. Ethan chuckled menacingly. "The strong silent type, huh? How cliché." He then rose and swiftly slammed his pistol into Keller's cheek. Keller fell onto the floor with a groan, and I seized the chance to draw my sidearm. "Put the gun down, Ethan," I instructed, aiming at him. He just shot me a strange glance and scoffed. So, you've denied her request. Put the gun down, I repeated, slowly and clearly. Ethan then tossed his pistol aside, glaring back at me. Keller got up and grabbed it, then the paper towels from my counter to mop his bloodied mouth. Get on your knees, hands on your head, Keller barked, aiming the pistol at him. Ethan didn't budge or even look at Keller. Yeah, guys, great detective work. Arrest the guy trying to stop the sex trafficking death cult. He's the real threat, Ethan quipped, falling to his knees and staring spitefully. His hands lifted to the back of his head, and Keller pulled out his cuffs. What do you know about it? I asked. Keller shot me a perturbed glance as he secured Ethan's hands. I know your boss is covering it up, and maybe others in the precinct are helping him. He sneered at Keller, and Keller backed off after securing the cuffs. You ever ask yourself why, Officer Watkins? I said nothing. Keller looked at me, and I hesitated. Were the corpses not proof enough for you? He asked. Did you do it, you sick fuck? Keller bellowed, but I knew he hadn't. I knew Ethan was trying to rattle me, but it was working, and his next quip took things to a whole different level. Don't you want to know what happened to your daughter? The air seemed to drain from the room then. I'd never been so conflicted in all my life, but nothing was more important to me than finding the truth of what happens to Chelsea. Greg, don't listen to him. He's full of shit, Keller argued, but he was wrong. There was no way Ethan could have known about my daughter, unless someone told him. Ethan stared into the depths of my soul. Help us stop them. Help us end it. Keller then kicked him in the ribs and shouted for him to shut up. I didn't think I'd ever been so conflicted in all my life. The memories of Chelsea swirled in my mind, and my failure anchored me to the spot. I had to know if Ethan was telling the truth, and I had to know whether Keller was with me. Why are you so intent on burying this? I looked to Keller, and he didn't seem to comprehend. Because he's a coward, and he's working to cover it up just like your boss, Ethan replied. Keller's look of confusion then turned to outright rage. He stepped towards Ethan, aiming the pistol at his head. I've heard enough from you. Keller wobbled on his feet, eyes vacuous and jaw slacked open. He fell backwards onto his back, dead before he struck the ground. Blood spurted from the bullet hole in the side of his skull. I felt the heat emanating from my revolver, and the horror of what I had just done swirled within my mind. Even Ethan appeared shocked by what I'd done. I approached Keller, grabbing the keys from his pocket. I unlocked Ethan's cuffs, and he stood beside me, giving me an odd but approving glance. I grabbed a piece of paper, jotting down a certain address. I then handed it and my revolver to Ethan. He took the paper, and a look of cold determination echoed onto his face. I believe you have work to do. Ethan simply nodded back and departed without another word. Once again, my sight beheld the grisly demise of Keller. Maybe he didn't deserve to die the way he did, but maybe if he'd been more willing to help, he'd still be alive. As I questioned myself, I saw something watching me from out the window. An ill-defined form with multiple drifting appendages, like an octopus comprised of shadow. It was a sight that would have been enough to terrify the hardest of people. But I was not afraid. I knew it was her, the one who brought about the meeting, and the best chance I had to find out what happened to my daughter, Osira. I turned away, grabbing my phone from the counter as she whispered. Cackling and hissing from the darkness, she was clearly quite impressed with my newfound devotion. I don't think I'll ever comprehend what she truly is, but the only thing that matters now is that I call her an ally. I dialed the dispatch on my phone, contemplating my next move as I waited for the call to be answered. A moment later, it was, and a determined smirk crossed my lips. Officer down.
You know that feeling you get when you see an abandoned building? It's that weird, internal, uncanny valley moment, because it's just wrong. It's that feeling that only intensifies when it's somewhere that looks like it was abandoned too soon or too abruptly. In the rural areas I grew up in, there are an exorbitant amount of these buildings. From what little I retained of middle school history, the town was hit hard during the Depression. With so few residents to begin with, the men leaving was near catastrophic. In a small town, these kinds of hardships can have the townsfolk take flight without much thought. This meant that a lot of businesses shut down right in the middle of operations, including the former main source of jobs around here, the old toy factory. The combination of creepy old dolls and unforeseen abandonment naturally bred tall tales. For years, the handful of teens in our town had dared each other to do what teens do. Dumb things. In the most cliché way possible, they'd dare each other to break in, spend the night, etc. With decades worth of ghost stories surrounding the building, it was some sort of rite of passage. None of them could ever be verified, but there were plenty of gruesome tales to be told about that facility. They often come with sparse or varying details, as oral tradition can encourage over time. One story that scared the hell out of me as a kid was about a woman who we'll just name Clara. The version my dad always told me went as follows. At the start of the draft, Clara found herself with a war-torn family, and subsequently without income. As many women of the time were forced to do, Clara sought out a job. As one could guess, her best option at the time was some menial work at the factory. Working in production wasn't the most riveting of jobs, but it's easy and bottom line, it was money. As if things didn't seem bleak enough, Clara had become pregnant. As exciting as this news would have been normally, it incited more dread than anything. She had found out shortly after her husband left, so was forced to push through on her own. About 7 months into the pregnancy, Clara's supervisor discreetly informed her that she would need to take leave approaching her delivery. Already at a loss for how she would care for the child and maintain her job after her delivery, the news that she would be losing 3 months of income devastated her. The notice arrived soon after, only piling onto her grief. Her husband would be making it home, but only in a pine box. Clara grew increasingly reclusive over the next couple months, not even showing her face at her husband's funeral. It wasn't until one Monday morning that Clara finally made her reappearance. With her hair in curls and her finest Sunday dress on, she boldly greeted all the factory workers with her new baby. At once, all the women let out gasps of varying degrees before being stunned into silence. After a full 60 seconds of unsettling quiet, a scream erupted from an older woman before she fell to her knees, sobbing. Some versions of the story even say the shock caused a heart attack that subsequently killed her. There Clara was, her lips a vibrant red and her eyes black as night. She was leaning her back against one of the machines, sitting with her legs neatly crossed, held against her bosom, mimicking the Madonna and Child. Her daughter lay limp. The umbilical cord still connected the mother and child like a string of fate. The baby's chest cavity had been crudely torn open and emptied of all organs. Most of the internals were strewn about with reckless abandon, except for the heart. The heart was clutched in the mother's hand with a portion missing, chewed off,
and coating Clara's lips, brighter than any lipstick could. Clara had gouged her eyes and cut her tongue out. Her stomach had been sliced open, the last clumsy work of a blind woman. She had been unable to look at her own abhorrent actions or taste her unborn daughter's heart. But it didn't stop her. We'll never know why Clara did what she did, but for whatever psychosis she experienced, it compelled her to commit such an atrocity. Some people say she refused to bring her daughter into such a cruel world. Eating her heart to forever bonds them even in death. Others say it was simply an act of evil and resentment towards the consequence of her pregnancy. Whatever the case, it is said that Clara still haunts the factory today. She weeps blood from her eyeless sockets and sobs from the gaping maw that had once been her mouth. In her left hand, she clutches the infant's beating heart, and in her right, she holds the umbilical cord. Her fetus hangs at the end of the umbilical cord. Its dead eyes somehow always trained on those unlucky enough to witness the apparition. .017. As an 8-year-old, I was absolutely terrified by the imagery. I have no shame in admitting that I was a scaredy cat as a kid, too spooked to even read scary stories to tell in the dark or watch Goosebumps until I was in middle school. I attribute this to an incredibly overactive imagination that I was unable to control. In my adulthood, I have embraced all things spooky into my career, but I'll touch more on that later. My dad was often woken up in the night by my irrational insistence that someone or something was going to kill me. He'd trudge down the hall, walk the perimeter of my room, and check every crevice. Unsurprisingly, there was never a trace of any murderer, a ghost, or demon. That wouldn't mean anything, however, when I was convinced once again a week later. Somehow, this never deterred him from painting images of horror as my bedtime stories, even if they were presented as cautionary tales. I was obviously too scared to ever even go near the facility for much of my childhood. As terrifying as the tale of Clara may be on its own, it wasn't the only deterrent. Not even close. I'll give you one more of my town's urban legends surrounding that old factory. Not long after the factory had closed, the tradition of teenagers breaking and entering began. For the most part, it was all fun and games. All through the 1950s, teens routinely sought out the factory to prove their status as a cool cat. Such were the intentions of two teenage boys called Danny and Michael. The two were the kind of best friends who did everything together, and this rite of passage was no exception. On the last weekend of summer before high school, the two decided they would enter this new chapter of their lives with an already impressive reputation. The minuscule size of the town allowed their claims of bravado to travel fast. By late afternoon, every teenager and the rare trusted adult knew Danny and Michael's intentions. The boys had managed to avert any parental suspicion with an easy lie about an end-of-summer sleepover, as had been customary throughout their lives. As the sun set, Danny and Michael left their houses with overnight bags in their hands. A quick bike ride, and they arrived at the entrance of the factory. What happened after that is unknown. The two of them brought the exact events of that night with them to the grave. There are a few things we do know about that night for certain. The boys spent at least enough time inside to smoke a pack of cigarettes, set up a little camp, and change their clothes. In fact, it looked like the two of them had been prepared to sleep, but never quite got that far. They were found 2 days later, but it wasn't in the factory at all. After failing to come home by the afternoon and some digging around amongst the local teens, their parents became increasingly worried. Naturally, After some coerced teen confessions, they checked the factory first and found only remnants of the boys' presence. The police were involved almost immediately. 2 missing teenagers raised red flags immediately, especially with murmurings of the infamous factory's involvement. So they searched. They poked in, around, and anywhere near the old building. No further sign of the 2 came up for 2 whole days. And then they appeared. Danny and Michael emerged from the woods around 6 p.m., right as the sun was setting. There were a few townsfolk who saw them and rushed to their sides. The state of the boys was beyond anything they'd ever seen, and bear in mind that a good few of the men were veterans. Danny's left arm was completely devoid of skin from the elbow down, just raw muscle and tendons exposed. On his other arm, the boy had open gouges along the entire length, deep enough to see the bone. His face was massacred beyond recognition. One eyeball was entirely missing, as were his lips and tongue. His nose had been sliced clean down the middle, the 2 halves hanging on by strings of cartilage. His legs were covered in deep scratches of near animalistic proportions, and upon further inspection, it was discovered that his left foot was entirely gone. Filling his shoe was simply a bony nub with what appeared to be more animalistic teeth marks. Michael hadn't fared any better than his companion. While his skin may have been mostly present, his features were not. His right arm was entirely gone up to the shoulder, as was his right ear and left hand. His left leg was gone up to the thigh, leaving the distinct question of how the hell he had made such a long trek hobbling on only 1 foot. The strangest part, there was no blood. Not a drop. The wounds appeared healed, as if they had been there for years. Scar tissue had even formed in some spots. Doctors later on would baffle over how the boys had even survived 2 days with such wounds, much less healed them. When the group who had discovered them finally spoke, they asked the most natural question. "Who did this to you?" The boys, turning to face each other for a moment, smiled. The smiles were barely distinguishable due to their injuries, but they were present enough to note nonetheless.
"He did,"
Michael spoke, first through garbled speech.
"Just like I did to him. It's okay."
And that was it. The 2 boys let out final wheezing laughs in unison and collapsed, dead at the edge of the forest. While it haunted me a lot less than the ghost story, this one always stuck with me too. According to some, there was a patch of dirt there that refused to sustain life to this day. I've seen the patch, and it is barren still. I'm certainly not saying it's due to the curse of Danny and Michael, but it did creep me out when I was younger. There are plenty more stories, but those were the 2 that stuck with me most vividly. Kids over the years continuously made up more and more stories until it was hard to tell where some of them even started. Hell, there was even jump rope songs written about the tragedies. Imagine a handful of kids gathered together, declaring to a cheerful tune, "Don't go down to the factory of old. Don't risk your life. We've all been told. Don't go down to the factory at night. You might lose your tongue and sight." It's a bit unnerving in retrospect. When I was 16, I made the decision to rebel in the little way that had become local commonplace. It was prom night. I was trying my hardest to impress the girl I liked, and there was a decent amount of fruit-flavored vodka in my system. So, when one of the guys in our group suggested we attempt a good old haunted break-in, I agreed. I pushed back all of the fear and trepidation that had been ever present in my adolescence and replaced it with the kind of bravery only peer pressure can produce. As we made our way through the overgrown fields surrounding the lot, I mentally thanked my past decision of a shorter dress, as opposed to anything with tulle. Our two other female companions had both chosen longer dresses and were struggling a hell of a lot more than I was. Nonetheless, we pressed on. Years ago, the town had stopped its attempts of keeping the windows boarded up. The building had been dilapidated beyond repair, and the persistence of teens was never-ending. Thus, it didn't take us very long to find a way in. A couple of kicks at a particularly weak spot, and boom, we're free to enter as we dared. I won't drag this part of the story on for too long. As with any urban legends, the actual experience rarely leads up to the hype. We all made a few lame attempts to make the experience spookier than it really was, sneaking up behind each other or kicking a dusty machine transformed into a jump scare. Later on, the guys would swear that they saw the speedy flitting of a ghost or two while inside. Everyone wanted to believe them, so it became a universal truth among us. That night, I returned home and was greeted by a smirk from my dad. One look at my tousled hair and mud-covered shoes told him all he needed to know.
Any apparitions or disgruntled workers?
He asked with a shake of his head. Yep, full apparitions, actually, I responded with a snort and a shake of my head right back. At least, according to the boys. Personally, I don't think any of those spooky stories you told me will ever scare me again. It did kind of look cool in there, though.
Oh, come on, kiddo,
he replied.
You loved those stories as a kid. Don't act like I didn't catch you watching horror movies when you're supposed to be asleep.
I couldn't help but laugh. Okay, but the reoccurring nightmares came way before my appreciation. The scariest part of that experience was the trip to get there after a night of dancing. I'm so sore. But hey, my dad called out after me when I was halfway up the stairs.
Don't go sniffing around abandoned places, okay? They can be dangerous. All kinds of rust and mold and glass and stuff you probably don't want to see anyway. Scariest thing isn't going to be the ghosts.
Okay, I groaned in the way that only teenagers can seem to muster up. My urban exploration days are long behind me. Good night. That, of course, proved to be a big old lie. Not intentionally, per se, but I did continue my urban exploration into adulthood. See, while we may not have seen what we sought after that night, I did notice something enticing to me. Walking into that creepy, abandoned factory was a rush. Ghost-free, but a rush nonetheless. There was an exhilaration to finally experiencing the truth for myself. It helped spark a passion in me that later evolved into a decently successful journalism career. I was 25 when I returned back to my town, camera and laptop in hand. I still visited a couple times a year for holidays, but I had moved from the small area at 18 to pursue university with no intention of moving back. I hadn't even stayed for more than a week at a time in those 7 years. I loved my family, but work was demanding, and so was being back in the place I grew up. This time, though, I was going to be there for a full month. I had put all of my work into the project that brought me home, and I didn't plan to rush it in the slightest. I had accrued a decent enough following to fund something I had long envisioned. Over the years, I had spent a significant amount of time urban exploring. It started out as photography during college and eventually evolved into a project displaying my two greater abilities,
haunting, often grimy photos paired with enticing stories about the history surrounding the building was my niche. I'm sure it's obvious, but I had the idea to do a piece surrounding my town early on. The decision to hold off on it was intentional. I knew that this one would be deeply personal and likely inspired by more passion than any other. I wanted to wait for the best opportunity, and there was no time better. I knew it would catapult my career forward if I did a good enough job. Arriving home, I was greeted with more hugs than I could count from my family. Admittedly, my family is small. My mom died when I was young enough that I can't remember her at all. My dad didn't even keep pictures of her because he said it was too painful. My mom's family hated my dad. That's what they told me. They never approved of their relationship, much less their creation of me. When my mom died, my dad was exiled even more, and they cared more about their resentment of him than a grandkid. It's all I've ever known, so it never really bothered me much. My dad's family was pretty much non-existent as well. Aside from my aunts, they were all either dead or estranged in some manner. Apparently, there was a lot of dark stuff running on that side of the family. Mental illness, addiction, suicide, stuff that Aunt and Dad only mentioned a couple times vaguely. Suffice it to say, we were close. The three of us didn't have anyone but each other, so naturally our relationships held a lot of value. Within a couple hours, my aunts had cooked up the kind of meal you can't replicate in a restaurant, and they had hounded me with questions. I told them about my career, this opportunity, and my plan for the project. While their excitement for my success was undeniable, there was still the very apparent nerves running through my dad.
I should have known you'd end up doing this someday,
my dad pointed out, his joking tone tinged with more nerves.
You always had to rebel just a little bit, huh? You remember what I told you, though, after all those silly stories?
Yes, Dad, I groaned, feeling a little bit like I was 16 again. I haven't forgotten because you've told me a million times before.
Look, you never know what you're gonna run into out there,
he said softly, his eyes darting over to my aunt for just a brief moment.
Just be safe, and don't go poking your nose into more trouble than you can handle.
The conversation lightened up after that, and I could only hope that they'd chill out over the course of the next month. I knew it was natural that they'd be worried about me, but I was an adult now. I won't bore you with too many details of the next couple of weeks. The first week, I spent enough time inside that grungy factory to become deeply acquainted. I took pictures non-stop. I sought after every possible shot I could. The creepier, the better. I will admit that I never once saw a ghost, only spiderwebs and rust. The 2 weeks after that was research. I scoured the library, town records, and the little bit of knowledge the internet had to offer. I interviewed as many townsfolk as I could, and acquired over a dozen stories about that factory, all crazier than the last. I was only able to confirm a few facts, though, as one might expect. 1, there was a woman called Clara who had died in the factory. Her obituary, however, told me very little. All it cited was that she died of unusual circumstances related to factory operations, and the dates. At the very least, it told me that her story was based in the tiniest modicum of truth. And 2, there were 2 boys who went missing after allegedly visiting the factory one night. The more gruesome details of their story were nowhere to be found, as I expected. They were found in the woods by a group of people in some sort of dire state beyond saving, but that was as far as it went. They, too, most certainly died, even if the details weren't exact. The rest of the deaths I found related to the old building were typically ruled as machinery malfunction, which wasn't the rarest thing at that time. The only thing left to do at that point was to write, edit, and get some last-minute shots of other abandoned businesses. It would help set the scene of this rural town left behind in the wake of industrialism. Since I'd left, even more places had become abandoned. It was sad, honestly, but not surprising. If I had never decided to approach the woods, my life would be easier. I wouldn't wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. Images I couldn't forget clouding my vision. I wouldn't have spent months reevaluating my entire life and trying my hardest to avoid an existential crisis. The fact of the matter, however, is that I did approach the woods that day. One seemingly perfect afternoon, I set out through the field where the two boys were found. The woods and the field had been abandoned long ago, just as the factory had. The spot that refused to grow anything was bare as ever, but everything else was overgrown entirely. Sometimes it felt like the whole town was just a couple years away from being abandoned entirely. At the time, this seemed like a good thing for my project. Overgrown, spooky woods where the bodies of two young boys were found. It could only increase the ambience I was going for. My dad and aunt would be furious if they found out where I was headed, but I figured I could handle it. My mistake began when I went deeper into the woods than I should have, having too much faith in myself. The artistic part of my brain drove me deeper and deeper into the thick brush. The lighting only seemed to get better as I delved deeper. So what was there to stop me? The echoing of adult voices from childhood was silenced. "Don't go into the woods. Nothing good ever comes from those woods," was replaced with, "Come on, look at that lighting. Look at those trees. They're asking to be part of your creepy article." The smell. That's what stopped me in my tracks for a moment. It was subtle at first, a sickly smell in the distance. For a while, I could pass it off as some dead animal in the distance. The 300 people who lived in the town may be too scared to occupy these woods, but the animals still thrived. Then it got worse, and worse, and worse, until it was stronger than one dead deer could produce. I had been in my fair share of woods over the years, and I have never experienced something this overwhelming. I'd gone deep enough into the forest now that I could no longer see the edges of the field anymore. In the distance, I saw something. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but it became apparent soon enough. It was another abandoned building. It was a cabin or a shed, as dilapidated as my usual subjects. I couldn't believe it. I thought this was a stroke of luck I could have never predicted. The smell was still stronger now, but I had weirdly grown a bit accustomed to it by then. I could press on further, for the sake of the peace. I was able to rationalize everything by backtracking on my old thoughts. Maybe some big predator had just been particularly fruitful. Maybe the smell was just due to some lucky cougar's feast. I knew this sounds stupid now, but in situations like that, your brain does everything it can to rationalize what's going on. I surely didn't want to believe anything was out of the ordinary. I had survived hours upon hours in the scariest place in town. What was the worst that could happen at some forgotten cabin? It only took me a few minutes to reach the cabin, and the smell continually got worse. It was pretty obvious at this point that it was coming from inside the derelict structure. Any reasonable person would have turned around immediately, but sometimes my passion outweighs my reason. The door was locked as I tugged on the knob. but I could see that the hinges were severely rusted. I'm a decently strong girl, so a few kicks with my boots and the door fell back. I expected there to be a loud noise as it slammed against the door, but quite the contrary. There was an odd, squishy noise as it fell, which would have floored me were there not a more pressing issue. The smell. It was so strong that I gagged instantly and yanked my jacket up over my face, zipping it up tight. It curbed the odor just enough for me to avoid actually vomiting. Once I was able to regain my breath and push past the smell, I could begin to register what was inside the cabin. At first, I thought it was furniture, covered in old, dirty sheets. I'd experienced that quite a few times in my line of work, but there was something distinctly different. It felt familiar, but wrong. How did I describe it earlier? Uncanny valley. The sheets were covering something. Lots of somethings. But it certainly wasn't furniture. Furniture doesn't ooze through sheets, typically. Especially not with thick, rust-colored liquid. Furniture doesn't let off the specific scent saponification can. And this certainly wasn't soap. My hand was vibrating like a hummingbird's wings as I reached for the corner of the closest sheet. My mind knew what was happening, but I couldn't move my feet. I couldn't leave this abominable scene until I was sure of what I suspected. I was only able to see one bloated, bruised hand before I took off. I was running faster than I ever had before, bile finding its way up my throat. The smell was stuck in my nose, and every single part of me felt dirty. I felt like the decay had taken over my very body, almost as if I had become one of the corpses. I fell to my knees as soon as I reached the famous clearing. Vomit and bile spilled out of me as I did. As disgusting as it was, I was almost grateful, because it beat the taste and smell of decay that was suffocating me. The first number I dialed was 911. I wasn't sure if they could make out exactly what I was saying, but I managed to give them my location and convey my frantic nature enough that the dispatch was immediate. The next person I called was my dad. I took a few minutes for him to calm me down enough so I could explain what happened. The line went silent for a moment after I choked out my story. "Dad," I wheezed out as the sirens in the distance grew closer.
"You call the cops?"
He finally asked. I thought it was strange for a first question after your daughter tells you that she found roughly 15 to 20 dead bodies, but hey, traumatic situations affect everyone differently.
"Did you call the cops? Where are they?"
I can see their lights. They're not far," I finally answered, with confusion evident in my tone. But, Dad, did you hear me? There's some kind of maniac out here. Some kind of serial killer in this town. And I just unveiled it."
"I know,"
he said. His tone suddenly so serious it gave me chills. His voice sounded different. It wasn't the same as the father I loved.
"I just hoped you never would."
The line went dead. I held my phone in my hand, a look of disbelief on my face. I barely had time to process what was happening before the cops arrived and began hounding me with questions. My head was spinning, and I found myself in the back of a cop car. I can't even remember what I told them, but it must have been enough. They found the bodies, and I was taken to the station. The first thing I tried to do at the police station was call my dad once more. No reply. Straight to voicemail. Then my aunt. Same thing. I felt anxiety building up in my chest. My dad's ominous words paired with the entire situation. It's obvious to say that something was wrong here. But it was something deeper. Something way more wrong than what first appeared. Hours later, I was kindly escorted back to my family's home. My voice had gone raw from the tears and seemingly endless statements I was asked to make. I walked to the door in some sort of trance, completely unsure of what I would find when I returned. I unlocked the door and swung it open. "Dad?" I called out once I stepped inside the dark house. "Auntie?" There was only silence, causing me to shake my head as I flipped the light switch. I stopped, dead in my tracks, as my surroundings came into clear view. It looked like we had been robbed, except in the most careful way possible. Almost everything personal was gone. All the furniture remained, but anything that seemed remotely specific to my family was just gone. I would find out later that my aunt's house was found to be in the same exact state by the time the cops got there. I jogged upstairs, peeking my head around every corner, into every room. There was nothing. Nothing until I reached my old room. The only room that had anything personal left in it. On my bed was a single envelope with my name written in my dad's familiar script. I swallowed heavily as I sat on the comforter and held it in my hands. There was no way anything in this envelope could hold good information. I just knew that in my soul. Nonetheless, I opened it with shaking hands and began to read. "Kiddo, I know this letter isn't going to reach you in the best circumstances. Probably the worst if we're being honest here. Honesty. That's something our relationship's been lacking from the beginning. But you have to understand, honesty meant losing you and whatever family we had built for ourselves. I can't say whether you'll view us as a family after everything, but know that I always will. There's a dark part to us all, even if it may display a little differently. Some people's dark parts manifest in the forms of addiction, some in wrath, or some in selfishness. For the unluckiest among us, our dark parts plague us in all of these ways, and more. For whatever mistakes I made, there's no denying that you came out better than any parent could wish for. Your dark parts are so outshined by the bright parts of you. I have envied you for this forever, and so has your aunt. See, we are the kind of people whose dark parts are inescapable. We are the unlucky few who cannot overcome the way our brains nag and pull at us to do the wrong thing, to make the wrong choices. That's how we found each other, years ago, in the deepest depths of our darkness. You were born in May. That is the truth. But I wasn't there for the birth. I wasn't there until you were 6 weeks old. I only met your mother once, and while her family resents me to this day, well, it's not for any reasons we told you. I didn't know you were there when it began. I didn't know that in this stranger's car I would find a wide-eyed, curious, and innocent baby. Contrary to popular belief, even us devils might have the occasional spark of guilt. I wanted to kill you. I wanted to be able to finish the job I had set out to do. I couldn't. Your aunt couldn't either. Admittedly, she was always the one who doubted our work more than I ever did. This became an anomaly to me. Why was empathy suddenly a trait I possessed? I was sure it had escaped me long ago. The plan was to leave you somewhere, drop you off on a doorstep and forget it ever happened. We could keep traveling, stay undetected, and never think of it again, but then your aunts proposed an idea. Despite the demonic desires in us, we still retain some semblance of humanity. She knew that both of us craved at least a mild sense of normalcy. She knew that we missed having a family, so why not create one? Few would suspect a tight-knit family in a small, rural town of the atrocities we committed. We found this town by accident. After days of driving and trying to figure out where the hell we could possibly build this insane idea, we found it. There were a couple hundred people, and it was practically off the map. These were simple people who stuck to their ways, and hell, the police department isn't anything to write home about. We had changed our identities over the years numerous times, but this would be the last. At least, we hoped. I know now that it won't. The sheer existence of this letter shows that I never thought we were safe. Not truly. Things were good for the first few years. The dark desires stopped in us both for a while, too distracted by raising a child to think about it. That's the thing about this darkness, though. It's never truly gone. Remember when we watched A Clockwork Orange as a kid? Remember how you said you don't understand why he kept doing bad things even after his rehabilitation? I couldn't admit to you that I completely understood. By the time we watched that movie, I had taken 6 more lives. Your aunt had assisted with 3 of them. As we told you it was just a movie, we knew in our hearts, as black as they may be, that it was a lie. You had been our rehabilitation. And despite our bold claims of being completely reformed, we returned to our own ways, just like Alex. We were good at scouting our victims. Hitchhikers, prostitutes, runaways, homeless folks. The tried and true nomads that the police brush aside. The kind of people that the LAPD would declare code "no humans alive" for. Never anyone local, never frequently enough to raise suspicions. Those business trips I was always on. Well, I'm sure you can piece that together. I'm not a fool. I couldn't have held this ruse up for as long as I did if I was. I know that we have been unfair to you, and I know that you will probably never see me as the father you grew up with again. I prepared myself for this possibility over the years. I just didn't think it would be this soon. I didn't think I'd miss out on grandkids. The people in this town, I knew they'd never find that cabin. I knew their superstition would keep it hidden. But you never quite fit in this town, did you? As much as I have thought about this over the years, I didn't allow my brain to consider the possibility that you'd be the one to find it. Our darkest secrets. It's unlikely that you'll ever find us. It's unlikely you will ever see your aunt or me again. It's probably better that way, right? And now that you know the truth. For all the lies, for all the violence, for all the sins, we never stopped loving you, not for a moment. It's unfortunate, but all those movies are a lie. Love can't conquer hate. Not when the hate is deep inside of you and inescapable. All love can do is curb that hate a little bit for a little while. Dad. I won't outline what happened next. There was a lot of procedural police work, a lot of crying, a lot of catatonic days, and existential crises. The next 6 months are still a blur. Even now, whole chunks of that time are missing in my memories. It took a little while, but my biological mother was found. For 25 years, she had been a Jane Doe, but through DNA testing, we found her. She had been a single mom, doing what she could to get by. When he got to her, she had been a single mom, doing what she could to get by. When he got to her, she had been picking me up from a babysitter after a late double shift. Ironically, she had very little family as well. The only family member I was able to connect with after all of this was her sister, my biological aunt. My grandparents were long dead, and she had no kids. My biological father's identity was never found, so I'll die without meeting that side of my family. For a long time, the man I knew as my father was unidentified. He had been careful and covered his tracks. My aunt, the exact same. It was obvious that they were professionals at this, prolific as they were, and seemingly able to escape authorities. Then, something happened. The police submitted some of the trace DNA evidence into CODIS, scanning through millions of samples. They got a hit. Shockingly, my former father and aunt had only ever been caught on a couple petty crimes. Theft, trespassing, a few things like that. Turns out they weren't even siblings, just partners in crime. They haven't been found, if you're wondering. It's been almost 10 years since I found that cabin, and a handful of years since they were identified. The case has gone cold for the most part, and a selfish part of me is grateful for that. As much as I want to bring them to justice, part of me worries it will make it all too real. I've managed to hold this suspension of disbelief in my mind for so long, I'm scared to see it go away. I want justice for the mother I never knew. I want justice for the childhood I lost. I want justice for all of those bodies I found covered in sheets and decay. Over half of them remain unidentified, with no leads. I just don't know when I'll be able to handle coming face to face with it. Coming face to face with the monsters that masqueraded as my family. The dreams I once had of a grieving mother hanging in an old factory are long gone. They were replaced with a different, reoccurring dream. My shaking hand slowly lifting a sheet, the scent of decay hitting my nostrils, and my feet moving as fast as possible. Sometimes in my dream, my dad is there. Sometimes my aunt. Sometimes they're laughing and sometimes they're crying. It always ends the same, though. They hug me, and at first, I hug back. Then they don't let go. They squeeze me tight until the air is gone, and I'm sucked into darkness. That's how it always ends. The darkness always takes over. Just like that monster said. Just like when the darkness tries to take over, and I feel that depth and shameful pang of longing. Longing for the family I once had, even if it was tainted with lies, death, and blood. I'm not like them, though. I tell myself that to make it better. Every day I fight the darkness, but every day I manage to win. I have a kid now, you see, and I owe it to her to give her the best childhood she could possibly have. My wife says I'm still trying to make up for my own childhood through our daughter, and maybe that's true. It could be worse, though. The piece I wrote about the town was put on hold for a while. But when I published it, it took off. My career went on a trajectory I could have only dreamed of. The addition of my gruesome discovery paired with a piece only added to its popularity. I know I need to tell my daughter about this at some point, but she is still young. Thinking about telling her still gives me anxiety. I have a long time until I have to face it, but the thoughts of watching the light in her turn to darkness plagues me. She is sunshine and happiness, but the words of that letter echo in my mind often. Love can't conquer hate, not when the hate is deep inside of you and inescapable. I'm going to prove that it is inescapable. I'm going to prove him wrong and conquer the hate that threatens my sanity if it's the last thing I do. The light inside me and the light I passed on to my daughter will burn bright enough to destroy that dark shadow that hangs over my life. I have faith in that.
If you made it to the end, I am proud of you. There is a secret hidden inside of one of the frames of this video. You will find it by adding up the numbers within the dates that each video on this list was originally published. From there, convert it to the timecode. There is no particular video order, just be sure to add a single number at a time. Month, day, year. For example, if the date is January 1st, 2019, the numbers will be 0 plus 1 plus 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 0 plus 1 plus 9. Once you have all 5 numbers, add them together. This number will be your frames. I will also mention, if you happen to skip to the end of this video, you are out of luck. There is a single number that is spoken completely out of place at some point during the video. Keen listeners will have heard it by this point and have this numerical secret to themselves. If you happen to come across this out-of-place number, it represents the frame rate. A calculator, which shall be beneficial to you, is at the top of the description. Each story within this video is also linked in the description. Once you add all of the publishing dates together, as well as integrate this spoken number, voila. I ask of you to please keep your answers, correct or incorrect, to yourselves. This will keep it as fun or frustrating for the next individual who comes along. And at the end of it all, don't take this too seriously. It is all for a bit of fun. Best of luck. V.